I think we are also largely aligned on the importance of rooting out fraud in the Employee Retention Tax Credit Program. We look forward to hearing about your efforts, not just in eliminating that fraud, but also making sure that small businesses across America who filed legitimate claims receive their credits as soon as possible. While I'm grateful for your partnership in these efforts, it won't surprise you that I also have a number of concerns about the Biden administration's approach to the IRS and about the IRS's handling of several important issues. Last time you were before this committee, the IRS had chosen to delay a provision of a law crafted by the Biden administration and congressional Democrats that would send tax forms to 44 million Americans just for engaging in transactions over $600 in a year. This includes transactions like simply selling a used couch or a concert ticket through a third-party payment platform. Once again, the IRS unilaterally chose to delay implementing the law or sending these forms, this time in an election year. To be clear, Republicans are united behind repealing this terrible policy, and I want to thank Representative Carol Miller for her leadership on the repeal effort. But the way to fix this terrible law is to repeal it, not to use the IRS to shield the Biden administration from the consequences of its own policies. Also, last time you were before this committee, you said the IRS would not retaliate against whistleblowers. One of the IRS whistleblowers who has appeared before this committee has since alleged the IRS retaliated against him for exposing the truth about the DOJ's preferential treatment of Hunter Biden. I hope you will share what steps have been taken to protect whistleblowers. And just a couple weeks ago, a judge sentenced an IRS contractor to 5 years in prison for the greatest theft of taxpayer information in American history. I think the Department of Justice woefully undercharged this individual, but I'm pleased the judge applied the maximum sentence available to her. But this story doesn't end with that case. The IRS must be accountable for allowing this theft to have ever happened and must ensure that it fixes security vulnerabilities at the agency. A recent report from the Inspector General described alarming details about how current IRS security flaws that demonstrate the problem has not been resolved. I hope that you will commit today to address their findings quickly for the sake of millions of taxpayers. We have serious questions about numerous other issues, such as the implementation of an IRS direct file scheme that the American people didn't ask for, how the IRS is spending its windfall of $80 billion, and Fantasyland claims about how much revenue the agency thinks it will generate from increased audits. Frankly, more of the IRS's time and resources should be directed toward improving its customer service for its existing duties, not spending money and resources on new systems no one has asked for. Part of that focus should be on deploying new technology to make the IRS more efficient. Proper use of technology can help avoid the need to hire thousands and thousands of new employees. I want to thank Representative Schweikert for leading the charge to ensure that the IRS is taking advantage of new technology to help taxpayers. Clearly, there is a lot the IRS needs to answer for, and I look forward to hearing how your agency plans to follow the law and protect taxpayers moving forward. I'm pleased to recognize Ranking Member Nill for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. So we want to welcome the Commissioner back to the Committee on Ways and Means. As always, it's delightful to have you with us in the middle of what promises to be another record-breaking filing season. The dedication of the employees of the Internal Revenue Service is remarkable. We want to thank them for their commitment to our taxpayers and fair tax administration, emphasis on the word fair, and for the swift implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Last filing season was the first impacted by the Democrats' multi-year investment from this historic legislation. While taxpayer service was dramatically improved, it was merely the consequence of a well-laid, well-funded plan. The results have been quite remarkable. In this era of service to America's taxpayers, the IRS beat Secretary Yellen's goal and delivered an 87% quality level of service. 3 million more phone calls were answered, while wait times were cut from 28 minutes to 3 minutes. Over 140,000 additional taxpayers were served in person. The 222 backlog was eliminated, and many new digital tools were introduced to make taxpayer experiences even easier. A reminder to our Republican colleagues, many of the recommendations that we entertained and discussed this morning came from Commissioner Rettig, a Republican who worked with all of us to ensure quality service. We know that expectations have been increased based on the success that the IRS has had so far. It was just last year that we discussed the future of the IRS ability to hold the top 1% of tax cheats accountable, and in a matter of months, over $500 million has been recovered from 1,600 wealthy tax avoiders. Another major victory is taxpayer fairness and a victory for the IRS. A reminder, if the revenue is not collected in a fair manner, that means the rest of us pay more. Yet the biggest threat to the IRS right now is the extremism of some of our colleagues. From the government shutdown that looms in just 5 legislative days to our colleagues' attempt to gut our investments every chance they've gotten, not only would this end up costing taxpayers money and adding to the deficit, but how can you argue with the success? I find myself wondering out loud about who wins when the IRS is starved for its resources. Perhaps our colleagues will have a chance to answer that this morning. Under Republican funding cuts, the audit rate on millionaires fell by more than 70% from 2010 to 2019. Those are numbers from Commissioner Rettig. And the audit rate on large corporations fell by more than 50%. That was a request from Commissioner Rettig. Workers and their families pay their fair share, and the American people can count on us to ensure that wealthy and well-connected people are paying their fair share too. While the promise of direct file draws near, and I'm optimistic about some prospects, I'm disappointed it wasn't already in time for the public to take advantage of it. We want to thank the Commissioner for his diligence being here today. We look forward to continue work on behalf of the American people. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. Today's sole witness is the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, Daniel Werfel. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. Commissioner Werfel, you may begin when you are ready.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the filing season and IRS operations. I am pleased to report that the 2024 filing season opened on schedule on January 29th and has gone smoothly so far. Along with filing season and other day-to-day operations, we continue to make important progress in our efforts to transform our agency through implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Using IRA funding, our work is centered on 3 fundamental themes. First, ensuring taxpayers can easily contact the IRS, whether in person, on the phone, or online. We want them to get help navigating complex tax laws and accessing the credits they deserve. Second, identifying the growing number of taxpayers with complex returns, including certain wealthy individuals, large corporations, and complex partnerships who are shielding income to evade their tax responsibility. We want to collect from them what is owed. And third, addressing the growing risk of tax scams and schemes by protecting honest taxpayers from them. We want to root out the nefarious actors that perpetrate them. These investments allow us to strengthen the overall effectiveness of IRS operations. As Commissioner, I want people to know that the IRS is on the side of taxpayers, and we are working to reflect that in every aspect of our operations while administering the nation's tax law. The IRS has been working hard to build on the accomplishments of last year. Our transformation goals for this filing season include providing an 85% level of service on our main toll-free phone line during the filing season. On the compliance side, we continue to increase scrutiny on those who evade taxes. We are working to reverse the historically low audit rates for large corporations, complex partnerships, and high-wealth individuals. During the past year, the IRS has also taken dramatic steps to strengthen our internal systems, protocols, and procedures by putting in place numerous improvements to bolster how we protect key systems and information. Our recent steps, enabled with new funding, have sharply reduced risks for taxpayers and the tax system. While taxpayers should rightfully be concerned about recent reports of the unauthorized access and disclosure that occurred in the 2017 to 2021 timeframe, the data security environment at the IRS is dramatically improved today. We have worked tirelessly this past year to close gaps that allowed this unfortunate event to transpire. However, there is always more work to do in this area, and we will continue our laser focus on strengthening data security. Another important aspect of our mission is implementing the tax laws fairly and justly. A key part of this involves making sure everyone pays the taxes they owe. But we also have a responsibility to protect taxpayers from being overly burdened in fulfilling their tax obligations. We work continuously to balance these two sides of the mission. This is the issue we faced in implementing the $600 threshold for 1099-K reporting that Congress passed in 2021. While it is important for us to have the information provided under the lower threshold, we must also consider the burden placed on taxpayers in meeting this requirement. Our administration of tax laws should be guided by what is best for taxpayers. In this situation, we delayed imposing the lower threshold because we realized that immediate implementation posed a high risk of taxpayers being confused and, given the complexities of the 1099 reporting, some potentially paying taxes they didn't actually owe. That is something we take very seriously, and we will do everything in our power to avoid. So the IRS is continuing to work to reduce that risk before imposing the $600 standard for business transactions. We will continue working this and getting feedback from key groups. I also want to assure the committee that the IRS is paying close attention to the potential passage of the child tax credit legislation. If Congress acts, the IRS is poised to move quickly to implement it. Building off our experience with economic impact payments during the pandemic, we may be able to start implementation as early as 6 to 12 weeks after passage, depending on the bill's final language. But taxpayers should not wait for this legislation to file their returns. We will take care of getting any additional refunds to taxpayers who have already filed. They won't need to take additional steps. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, that concludes my statement. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session. Commissioner Werfel, as you know, the House passed the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act, included adjustments to child tax credit. You just briefly touched on that. I want to ask some additional questions to make the record reflect appropriately. But the bill passed through this committee by a vote of 40-3, and it received 357 votes on the House floor. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I appreciate the work you and your team have done to help ensure that the bill can be implemented as quickly as possible. I just want to confirm a few details with you. The overwhelming majority of American taxpayers are guaranteed to have no adjustment to their tax liability due to the child tax credit changes in this bill. In fact, can you confirm that only roughly 10% of households will be effective and will receive just modest adjustments to their tax refunds?
Yes. In fact, in looking at the numbers, if you look at the same eligible population in fiscal year 22, it was about 22.5 million people. So that metric that you offered is in line with our understanding of how it's going to impact taxpayers going forward.
Thank you. We worked with your team to make sure the bill did not place a new burden on taxpayers and can be implemented without delay. Can you confirm that taxpayers do not need to file amended returns to obtain the adjustments the bill makes, further speeding things up?
Yes.
Thank you. There is language in the legislation requiring the IRS to process any additional returns without delay. As a matter of fact, that was language we added during the markup in this room. If the bill is passed by the Senate and signed into law, how quickly will you be able to make the child tax credit adjustments for this filing season? In other words, how long will it take after bill signage for the IRS to send out any additional refunds?
Well, we gave you a range of 6 to 12 weeks required for implementation from the point of enactment. The reason we give a range is because we need to see the final language, but I'm committed to work diligently to make sure we're closer to the 6-week end of that range than the 12-week.
I appreciate hearing that, Commissioner. So just to be clear, we have your commitment that the IRS will move as quickly as possible.
It will be a top priority to make sure that this gets done.
Thank you, sir. In the past, Congress has asked the IRS to make changes during tax filing season. In fact, Congress has asked the IRS to make much larger changes than this bill does, like sending stimulus checks to hundreds of millions of taxpayers, or creating a monthly check sending system for the child tax credit on the fly. The number of taxpayers affected here is a fraction of those affected in those other programs. Given that, can you confirm the administrative adjustments needed to implement the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act are a much lighter lift for the IRS than for those other programs?
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, the work that we did to implement the payments that you referred allowed us to build additional capacity to make us even more ready for this change.
Thank you, sir. Commissioner Werfel, the individual who stole and disclosed the tax information of thousands of Americans has now been punished with a sentence of 5 years in prison. While I'm glad the judge in the case sentenced him to the maximum available to her, I was surprised that the Department of Justice only charged the individual with one count of unauthorized disclosure and no other crimes. Did you make a recommendation to the Department of Justice on how to charge in this case?
No, that's not the role of the IRS Commissioner. We allow and defer to the Department of Justice on prosecutorial decisions.
Do you think one count of disclosure matches the crime committed?
I think that protecting taxpayer information from unauthorized access is an absolute solemn responsibility of the IRS. And I also believe that this individual betrayed the trust. He betrayed his own commitments. He betrayed IRS employees, and he betrayed the American tax people. And that type of betrayal should not be tolerated. And based on what's playing out in court, it's not being tolerated because this person is being brought to justice, and as I understand it, is going to spend years in prison.
5 years. Do you think the penalty should have been higher for this individual?
I don't have a judgment on that, Mr. Chairman. I rely on the court and the judicial process to play out, and I trust that the judicial process will get the right answer.
I was looking at more of the legislative process of whether Congress should change and increase the penalties for someone who abuses taxpayer information like this situation. I now recognize the ranking member for any questions he might have.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, what's the IRS done to restore an element of fairness to the tax system, and are there any new compliance push that you are aware of to audit high-income earners and big corporations?
Yeah, thank you for the question. See, what happened in the period before the Inflation Reduction Act, when IRS funding was low and we weren't making the appropriate investments, is there's a variety of different areas we fell behind. And one of the key areas we fell behind is the ability to assess complex returns. So in situations where taxpayers had the means to hire an army of lawyers or an accountants to create a lot of complexity in their return and potentially shield income, we weren't making the appropriate investments to track that, assess it, and collect it. And now we are doing just that. With the Inflation Reduction Act resources, we are focused on building our capacity around how to deal with complex returns and how to make sure there's fairness. Because if you're a taxpayer who can't afford to hire a lawyer or an accountant to help you create complexity and shield your income, then you would likely be very frustrated if those that did have the resources could do that and evade what they owe. And we have to close that gap, and we're making really important progress already in closing that gap.
Thanks. And Commissioner, let's talk about data security. I thought your answer and your introductory comments was on target. You want to talk about data security and the improvements that have been made in your time as Commissioner?
Yeah, I mentioned how important, in the answer to Mr. Chairman's question, data security is to the IRS. It is fundamental to what we do in ensuring the public trust. When I got to the IRS, one of the first things I did in March of 2023 was pull the team in together and ask, what is the state of our data security environment? And what I learned was there were a lot of gaps. And one of the primary causes of those gaps was lack of investment. The underfunding that had occurred for many years at the IRS, I said, decreased our capacity in a variety of different ways. And one of those ways was to keep pace with investing in the type of technology, process change, controls to make sure that our environment was secure. And we have spent the last year working diligently to close those gaps. And there is a long laundry list of steps we have taken to completely dramatically change our environment. And I'll point out one important one. The Inspector General, in evaluating our security environment, pointed specifically to a lack of audit trails in our system so that we can see how data is moving throughout the organization and we can track and see if it's moving in an inappropriate way. I required, and it's now been implemented, that every sensitive system in the IRS has the very robust audit trails that the Inspector General required. Again, before the Inflation Reduction Act, we didn't have the resources to put in the work to close these gaps. And that's why it is so important that the IRS be funded adequately for its operations, not just so that we can answer the phone when people call us, not so that we can keep pace with complex returns, but we need to invest in our infrastructure and invest in our data security so events like what happened in 2017 to 2020, that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I don't understand the logic that sometimes is offered that if we cut the IRS, then somehow we're going to improve compliance. The logic escapes me. So let me give you some time here. You've got a minute and 15 seconds to talk about some of the other additions to your testimony that you might like to offer.
Absolutely. So I really want to amplify this point about what a funded IRS means versus what it doesn't. And we have all the evidence we need in looking at the state of the IRS before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed versus where it is today. And before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, our walk-in centers around the country were closed or understaffed with lines around the block. And now, just a few years later, we've opened 50 new walk-in centers. They're fully staffed. We're extending hours to Saturday for people who can't get to us during the week. And we're implementing what we call pop-up walk-in centers, going to remote populations. So if people want to see us in person, they now can. A second example is with the phones. We were understaffed by thousands of phone assisters because of underfunding. What did we do with the funding? We hired 5,000 phone assisters, put them in the call center, and between before the Inflation Reduction Act and after, there was a dramatic change in our ability to answer the phone and help taxpayers with their questions. And the same is true for digital. We have a whole generation of taxpayers that is going to expect, as they should, to be able to do everything they ever wanted to do with the IRS without calling us, without going into our walk-in centers. And before we were funded, our technology tools were stagnant. They weren't being updated in the way you would see either other tax jurisdictions around the world or in the financial services sector and the retail sector. That's all changing now. We have work to do, but now every time taxpayers come to to be with the IRS and filling out their taxes or answering a question, when they go to our website each filing season, they're going to see a new set of tools, new functionality, new things that they can do without ever calling us or walking into a walk-in center, because we're investing and focusing our investments on how do we best serve taxpayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Commissioner for being here today. I chaired the Florida Chamber. We had 30,000 businesses in the Federation across Florida. One of the biggest issues, and I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier, is dispute resolution. And I'm talking about companies with 50 employees or less. The cost of hiring accountants, and maybe you have to get an attorney and go through that whole process, is very time consuming. Many times we'll put them out of business, some of them. But I think it's got a little bit better. But what's your mindset of where we're at in terms of, it seems like we want to get a fair deal for the IRS, for the country, but then resolve as many of these disputes as we can. Some of them claim they're out there a year, 6 months, 8 months. It ties up their energy, their time, and their enterprise. And you mentioned that, you know, the big corporations, one thing, but small business and individuals as well. But I'm just focused right now on small business.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, Congressman. I haven't mentioned it yet, but one of the things that guides me in the job is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. I have it framed above my desk. I have it with me today. It's kind of like some people carry around their pocket constitution. I carry around the Taxpayer Bill of Rights because it's so important that in everything we do, we're guided by it. And one of those rights is the right to speedily resolve your issues. And I want to make the right investments so that we are doing that. And that's a multi-pronged set of solutions. It's, for example, having clear notices, clear guidance. So if the law is complicated, the IRS is translating it clearly so we never get to a dispute. It's doing outreach to small businesses with training and webinars. We're investing to what are your questions and how can we help you? And then it's hiring more people and working to make sure that there is no dispute resolution that's taking too long.
I only got a few minutes. I got a couple of things I want to get through. Identity theft. It was
Yes.
a huge issue. Again, it seems like it's organized groups and stuff are still out there. Where are we at with identity theft now? Because I had a lot of people in our region in Florida where their identity was stolen, the tax returns were filed on behalf of the thief or whatever, or some organized group. What's your sense of where that's at?
Well, it's critical, and it's a top priority. I mentioned top 3 things we want to do under the Inflation Reduction Act, and one is prevent people from being victimized. And this is a mixed story. I wish it was all good. We've made significant progress in preventing identity theft. Working with private sector partners in what we call our Security Summit, we now prevent 98% of identity theft attacks, if you will. But in the case where there is a victim, as was recently pointed out by a taxpayer advocate report, we are not resolving those issues quick enough. And so it's a priority going forward that not only to continue our strong performance in preventing identity theft, but also when it happens and there's a victim, to raise our game and make sure that we're providing that victim assistance in a much more robust way.
Yeah, let me ask you one other thing on in terms of customer service. I know you touched on that, just talking to accountants and things locally, and it does seem like, I want to give you a little credit, it seems like things have got a little bit better, but still, they're on the phone for over an hour, they're aggravated. You know, being someone's in business, you want to take care of those folks as quickly as you can, at least in terms of answering the phone, get their questions answered. And you touched on it in your early testimony, but where's your sense of where we're going to get to a point where we can answer the phone quicker and try to get them a little bit more help from a quicker stance?
So we're on our main phone line, which is where most of the volume comes. We're at an 85% level of service, but there's more to do. There are other phone lines that we need to continue to work on and improve. And let me give you an important example of what we're doing. I don't ever want to hear about someone waiting on the phone for an hour. That is heartbreaking, frustrating, but it's also a rallying cry for us. One of the things we've done this year is we've instituted a callback option. And what that means is that the way we're engineering our call center now, if your wait time is going to be longer than 15 minutes, we will introduce into the phone hey, we can schedule a callback option. So you can hang up, no longer listen to elevator music, and we'll call you back. These are the types of improvements. I know this happens in your everyday life when you're on any other call center in the retail industry and otherwise banking industry. We have some catching up to do. But because we have funding, we can make these investments, and these are really helpful to taxpayers because now, if they've got a baby crying or something, they can hang up and get a callback option.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Doggett is recognized.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Commissioner, for the efforts that you and your team have made to address many of the problems that have been created over the last decade prior to the last Congress by those who seemed intent on ensuring that IRS would fail by cutting the budget again and again and continually attacking and stirring public dissatisfaction with the IRS. As I understand your testimony, we've gone from a low of 15% satisfaction to 85% satisfaction. Is that right?
That's correct.
I remember having not only complaints from constituents before we provided these funds, but even from CPAs and tax preparers that had a special line that were kept holding in the very way you said they are not today. And you could not have had these successes, and your team could not have had these successes without the additional funding you were provided by the last Congress. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Of course, the other area that's very important to me is enforcing our tax laws so that the many people that are out there that are paying their fair share are not abused by those who refuse to do so. And the data that I've seen suggest that audit rates for large corporations in the decade prior to the last Congress were cut in half, and that the audit rates for those who earned over $1 million per year were cut by about 70%. That the top 1% was getting away with not paying an estimated $160 billion in taxes each year. I know that you reported progress being made on tax enforcement earlier this year and a significant increase in revenue as a result. Were the people that you were after, were they the kind we hear about in some of these campaign speeches that, you know, just had honest mistakes and left a little off their return, or were they true tax cheats? And can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I can't emphasize this enough, Congressman. Our focus, our priority, and our agenda under the Inflation Reduction Act is to increase scrutiny for complex filers, wealthy individuals, large corporations, and complex partnerships that are evading their tax responsibility. It is not our intent to increase scrutiny and invest this money on a new wave of audits for middle and low income. That's not going to happen under my watch. And we will be able to publicly report that so that you can hold me accountable for that. With respect to high wealth, there's a lot of different things we're doing to start to catch up and close the gap that's been there for too many years. And one of the things that we can report immediate results on, because often these enforcement actions take time, but there are some things we're doing that should give the American people confidence that we are using this money smartly and in a way that's creating fairness, and that is going after millionaires and billionaires who are delinquent on owed taxes. And this should frustrate people. These are millionaires and billionaires who have been assessed a tax due and are delinquent in paying it. And we have so many honest Americans who pay their taxes on time, and these millionaires and billionaires are not. So we have created this high-risk list of 1,600 of these individuals, and we've started to go get the money back. And so far, in the early stages of this effort, we've already collected $500 million. And that's just scratching the surface. So that should give you a sense of how much inequity there is and how much, if we stay on this path, we're going to be able to close that inequity gap.
And if I understand, to stay on this path, you've indicated that you need about another $800 million this year.
Yes, and that is an important point about our budget. And I'll just, if I could just say it briefly, we have a base budget to fund our ongoing operations, keep the lights on, and then we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is modernizing and helping us build capacities. Our base budget is insufficient to run the daily train schedules. And what that means is we have to borrow from the modernization fund just to keep the lights on. And if we keep doing that, we won't modernize. We'll keep the lights on, but we won't build these capacities that are so important to help taxpayers.
And I believe the Treasury, just within the last 2 weeks, has estimated that as much as $561 billion could be collected over the next decade from wealthy and corporate tax cheats that you're focused on. And yet, unfortunately, our Republican colleagues on this committee and elsewhere seem to have no higher priority, as indicated by the first bill they passed in this Congress, and their efforts at every time we get up to the brink of disaster here, that they want to cut the very funding you're relying on to see that these corporate and high-wealth tax cheats are treated the same way and pay their taxes the way most Americans do. I just want to thank you for your efforts, and we will do all we can to resist the efforts to undermine the progress that you're making.
Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here today. I want to certainly register the fact that my office continues to receive input from constituents that they are not getting their questions answered from the IRS. I realize you're touting an 85% efficiency level and that everything's just amazing at the IRS. I continue to have concerns that the $80 billion in IRA funding is not giving us the results perhaps that were promised. Also, certainly there's a lack of candor, I believe, from the administration about how the funds are actually being utilized. Particularly troubled that the administration continues to implement policies across numerous agencies, regardless of whether it is legislated authority or not. Student loan forgiveness, critical mineral agreements, and the recent changes to the 1099-K requirement from ARPA are all examples of this kind of executive overreach. The development of the IRS's direct e-file system also appears to fit that description. While IRA, the bill, so-called Inflation Reduction Act, provided $15 million to conduct a study of direct e-file and enumerated the study's parameters, it provided funding for only 9 months and said nothing about actually implementing that system. The 9 months authorized for that study have now lapsed, as I'm sure you're aware. Can you tell me explicitly what authority the IRS relied on to create an entirely new government-run system of filing taxes, since the law only provided authority to conduct a study on the direct e-file system? And I'm not looking for other examples of the IRS helping people file their taxes. I get that. I want specific language from the federal code authorizing the particular pilot.
Yeah, absolutely, Congressman. I appreciate the question. So we do have a responsibility and an authority to offer taxpayers different approaches for how to meet their tax obligation. I can give you the exact statutory site for that. What's critical about the direct file solution is that it is an option. There is no mandate for anyone to use this solution should they choose it.
But you're saying there's direct authority to do so?
There's direct authority to implement the tax system in a way that provides tools and solutions for taxpayers to meet their tax responsibility.
Generically speaking, but
yeah, well,
in terms of this
paper,
government
electronic, calling us on the telephone. Not everything is delineated precisely in law. So, for example, if we create a Adobe version of the tax form that you can fill in online, we've done that. There's not a specific legal authority to do that, but there is a legal description of the commissioner's responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is to provide taxpayers with avenues for how they can meet their tax obligation. And this is just one avenue. It's not a mandate, it's an option.
Well, I understand that, which may not be a mandate, does not always mean there's the authority to do so. And I would argue that that is the case right now. I'm specifically troubled by the claim that there's that authority there when I don't believe that there is. But let's go back to the topic I've discussed with you and Secretary Yellen previously on multiple occasions, and that's audits targeting families earning less than $400,000. I continue to have concerns that, despite the claims from Secretary Yellen and others, that the administration cannot and will not fulfill its promise about audit targets and also meet its claims about increased revenue. Last year, you said in response to a question for the record that the IRS is committed to ensuring that none of the funds provided by the IRA will be used to increase audit rates for small businesses and households making less than $400,000 annually relative to historical levels, and that's a quote. The phrase historical levels means something higher than the current audit rates. Is that accurate?
No, it's not accurate. We've been public. I don't think. Let me tell you what the current situation is. Tax year 2018 will be the base year that we will utilize to make sure that the audit rate for those that earn less than 400,000 does not exceed
reclaiming
that.
my time because time is of the essence here. I'd like to learn more about that, but I would also like to know if the IRS can provide us with a distributional table for the $561 billion and the $851 billion estimates of revenue generation, and do you know when we could plan to see that?
Well, we have a public report on that, so I would be happy to engage with your staff to understand what are the specific questions or additional layers of information beyond the public report.
How did you decide to choose 2018 as the year to establish the historical rate levels of audits?
Well, in large measure because it is a historically low rate, and we wanted to assure the taxpaying community that the Inflation Reduction Act would not be used to increase the audit rate among middle and low income. And so we chose 2018 as a historic low rate to provide additional assurances. And we wanted to be specific so that we can be transparent and hold me to account and the IRS to account, because each year we publish our audit rate in our data book. So you can go into our data book right now and see exactly what the audit rate is for 2018. And then when we finish with tax year 23 and the audit rates are complete, you'll say, oh, let me see. Did they meet their mandate? And it should be all public.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you've generated about $500 million, half a billion, I think, in your words, of revenue from about 1,600 targeted taxpayers. That would be on average of just over $300,000 per taxpayer. How many resources, the dollar figure of the IRS taxpayer dollars, do you think it would take on average to reach that level?
I'd have to get back to you on a specific, but it certainly has a very positive ROI. In general, and this is something that the Congressional Budget Office has publicly reported, that in general, we return $6 for every $1 invested. So on average, you should expect about a 1-to-6 ratio. So we spend a sixth of those resources to get the job done, on average.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Commissioner, thank you for being here. First, congratulations for the work the IRS has done over the past several months. As the ranking member, Chairman Neal mentioned, Democrats on this committee made an historic investment in the IRS last year when we passed the Inflation Reduction Act. Since then, I can tell you, I've heard from my staff in all three of my district offices how well they're working with the IRS. They have contact with your office hundreds, if not thousands of times a year, and they tell me that the IRS is noticeably significantly smoother than they've ever been before. You're responding faster, your responses are better, people answer the phones. My staff find the taxpayer advocates to be reliable and helpful partners as we try and work with our constituents. I've personally worked with you and with your team on specific issues, and I want to thank you. I've always found you to be helpful and your team to be professional and very well prepared. Unfortunately, the majority seems to think that the IRS budget is a slush fund to pay for every program that they want to pass and put into law. And I've lost track how many times they've tried to use the IRS budget to offset spending, despite reams of evidence proving that IRS cuts actually increase the deficit. I believe the only reason to work to cut the IRS budget is to either make consumer services worse or to make cheating on your taxes easier. I understand people don't like paying taxes, but this is how we fund our civilized society and the many programs that our constituents care about.
So while we can disagree about tax policy on the specifics, we ought to all agree that on a bipartisan basis that people should follow the law and pay the taxes that they owe. Commissioner, when IRS funding is cut, what happens to our deficit?
It goes up. In fact, for every $100 million taken from the IRS, the deficit grows by $600 million over 10 years. And that's because
600 million.
600 million.
Increase in our deficit.
For every 100 million cut, it's a $600 million increase in our deficit.
So when the IRS funding is cut, is it harder or is it easier for people to cheat on their taxes?
It's easier. And let me just, if I can go through $100 million, what that buys you at the IRS, 700 audits of high-income taxpayers, millionaires and billionaires, 200 audits of complex partnerships, 100 audits of large corporations, 32,000 collection cases of wealthy individuals, and on and on. And that's just from the 100 million. So clearly it has an impact.
Thank you. One thing that hopefully we can agree on both sides of the dais is modernization. Can you talk a little bit more about how you've used Inflation Reduction Act investments to modernize?
Yeah, absolutely. There's, one of the things that inspires me, Congressman, is before the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a famous picture in the Washington Post of our cafeteria in Austin, Texas, filled with unreviewed returns in paper. That cafeteria is now clean. People are eating in it rather than us storing tax returns. That's because we are aggressively digitizing and scanning all of our paper as part of our initiative to go paperless. This is important not because it's more efficient and more secure, but it means that we're going to process more quickly. And one of the things that's going on due to our modernization is we have significantly reduced the ongoing backlog of returns and correspondences.
Thank you. I'd like to just take a moment to talk about the investment in climate change in the IRA. This was the biggest investment in climate work in history in our country. How would you describe the rollout so far, and how would you characterize the uptake on tax credits like EV or solar credits?
Yeah, we've had a successful launch. In January, we launched our portal, our IT solution, that allows those that are eligible for credits related to the manufacturing and the transactions associated with electronic vehicles. And like any new solution, there are certain things that we could do to make it better and improve the customer experience. But overall, it's been robust participation, and the system has performed as expected.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for conducting the hearing today. Mr. Werfel, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I think some of the questions revolve around this. We do telephone town halls, and we did one a little bit over a week ago. And when we do IRS town halls, it just seems like we can't be on the phone long enough, and the IRS provides people, and the taxpayer advocate is there on the phone with us. But I don't think there's anything more complicated than what we're talking about today when it comes to the IRS and the rules and how it works and who's paying fairly and who's taking advantage, and it goes back and forth. I wish we could just get to a situation of, is this a program, is this an agency that runs in the best interest of the people who fund it? And the same people who fund everything else in our government, and that is hardworking American taxpayers. I've got to tell you, from a standpoint of formerly being in the private sector and have, while I was present, I was not in the operation at the time of going through the early days of the pandemic. And one of the things that came out, which was a really good idea, was the Employee Retention Tax Credit Program. However, we continue to look at programs, and we tend to look at holdups in it. My son runs our business, and I talked to him on the phone about it quite a bit. He said, I think the biggest thing would have been had employers been able to get some help or some counsel on how that was working or how it was supposed to work, how they could do that. But we look back on it now, and we're trying to find out what is going on with that program. And while there's all kind of different figures floating around about what it has cost, I would just caution people to say, you know, anytime we say it costs the government, we keep in mind that it actually then gave taxpayers a break on what comes out of their wallet, knowing that they provide every single penny, either with their wages or by co-signing a loan to fund this incredible operation. So when it comes to the IRS right now and in ensuring that small businesses receive their ERTCs, what's the oversight in that, and how can you help us with that? Because I have a number of friends, and I met with our former Representative Billy Long the other day, whose concern for a lot of the people that he still works with is the fact that there is confusion on what quarter is being funded and what is the timeline and what's ending and what's still in operation and where should we go from here.
It's, well, first of all, I appreciate the question and the way you worded it, because how you can help. One of the things I've learned early in my tenure here at the IRS is that we can't do this alone. Implementing the tax system is a partnership. It's a partnership with IRS and tax professionals, taxpayers, Congress. The ERC is an incredibly complicated program. It was critical and played a critical role. We issued 3.6 million ERCs to date, and it was an economic lifeline for people that needed it. What happened is the further we got away from the period of eligibility, because the demonstrated loss that you have in order to claim eligibility ended on December 31st, 2021. The further we got away from it, the more aggressive promoters and marketers started, in my opinion, taking advantage of honest small businesses and getting them to believe that they were eligible for a credit they truly weren't eligible for. So 18 months, 19 months, 20 months after that period of eligibility, the number of ERC credits coming in to the IRS was actually increasing. 50,000 a week, 60,000 a week, 70,000 a week. And we started to realize that there were so many ineligible claims in what was coming in. It was getting harder and harder to separate what's ineligible from eligible. And that's why we issued the moratorium in September of 2023, because we wanted to slow the flow of these credits coming in and make sure that we were not paying out fraudulent claims. And so what we announced is we're going to have to slow the process down to protect taxpayers, not just taxpayers, the financial bottom line. Taxpayers don't want us spending out fraudulent claims, but also protect small businesses who may have been taken advantage by these aggressive promoters.
Well, I appreciate that. But the guidance is the key to all these things as we go through, and these are very complicated issues, but there are people who filed believing that this was going to be taken care of, and you're on hold, and you don't know. It makes it very difficult for people then to actually file their claims at the end of every year. Just one thing covered real quickly. The direct file program. So we've had people in the private sector running this, and I think we've had great success with it. Why did the IRS get involved in this?
Yeah.
And what is it that we're trying to achieve? And listen, you're down to 1 second. I don't expect an answer that quickly, but if you get back to me in that, because
Absolutely.
I think it is a legitimate question of if we have all these available already through the private sector, and we're talking about money being well spent, well, I think it's already there for people. I don't understand what role the IRS would have in that, and I don't question the fact that you think you could help. It's already there. Thank you. I yield back, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquarello.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. It's a lovely day in the neighborhood. Commissioner Werfel, you've been a breath of fresh air to me. We had little problems with the last guy who sat in your seat. Welcome back. After years of chaos, very new day at the IRS. Last month, you already talked about it. The IRS announced that it recovered $485 million from only 1,600 millionaires. The question of fairness in the tax system is at hand. We all have different opinions about it, but I believe, or else I wouldn't say it, I believe that you're there to oversee fairness. The guy next door to me, where I live, in my house in New Jersey, if he doesn't pay his property taxes, and the guy on the next block from us doesn't pay his property taxes, people understand now that we're going to have to pay higher property taxes unless some other kind of revenue was found. It's tax fairness. Pay what you're supposed to pay, and people will complain less. People believe many times, Mr. Werfel, Commissioner, that they're being shafted when it comes to figuring out tax policy. And I think you and I have an obligation to address that day in and day out. The tip of the iceberg. Last week we learned that we will recover at least $560 billion from rich tax cheats after the next decade. So you've been portrayed, the group, the agency you work for has been betrayed as, oh, they're coming after you. See, create fear that you're the bad guys. Lincoln dealt with that during the Civil War, very honestly. If money was going to be used for the war, how would the towns throughout America, you know, build their roads, their hospitals, their schools, et cetera, et cetera? That's why we have a big argument over salt. I hear from my own neighbors, you are now answering our calls. Refund checks are going out faster. These successes are because of, I think, your leadership, and because of historic funding passed by Democrats, mostly, to make the IRS work for regular Americans. Wow. I remind everyone, every single Republican in Congress voted against the Inflation Reduction Act and against funding for the IRS to do its job. I mean, the facts are the facts. As Tom Suozzi would say, the facts are the facts. Members of the other side have made IRS funding their white whale to be harpooned at any cost. They have clawed back 1/4 of the historic funding. Like the shark in Jaws, they want another bite. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that funding that I believe Republicans stole away will cost the American people double, nearly $400 billion, nearly $40 billion, excuse me. So I have a question for you. Millionaires and billionaires need to pay their fair share. I think everybody will agree up here. I think, I'm not sure. What is the IRS doing to audit high net wealth individuals and tax cheats?
Congressman, it's where we're focused, and we're taking multiple different steps. First of all, we're hiring additional accountants, auditors, and where they're being deployed and where we're shifting our audit workforce is to make sure that we're focusing efforts on high wealth individuals, because that's where we think we have a growing problem of tax evasion, and we need to address it. We're deploying technology differently. We're using analytics and AI to better understand how money moves in these very complicated arrangements. You know, companies with subsidiaries and subsidiaries to those subsidiaries, money moving across international jurisdictions, understating their profits in the U.S., doing all of these things that are difficult to track, and we're investing in subject matter expertise, people, technology, analytics, all so that we can catch up and make this fair. Because we should be able to have equal ability to assess the guy down the street's taxes as your taxes. And if you're middle and low income, mostly your taxes are fairly simple. And we have the means and the capacity to assess it. Where we have lost the capacity is for the complicated situations. And when we're underfunded, that gap grows. And so as long as I'm commissioner and the funding is available, where I'm going to focus is on the gap where the tax returns are complicated and where the evasion is expanding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner, and forgive me because I'm assembling some of the numbers right in front of me. Because as the chairman spoke, I have a fixation that the adoption of technology is the ultimate solution here. It's the solution for the left that wants more tax receipts, and for those of us who want a friendlier, more efficient, and effective IRS. You before made a comment that, hey, it's 6-1, but I'm looking at, and this is even from the preliminary data from Representative Pasquale actually asked for a CBO report, and your press release that you took in $520 million, but I'm looking at your cost, I actually see you, for every dollar, it costs you $10.96. Now, I accept there's capital expenditures in there, and over time, they'll be amortized out, but most of the IRA funding looks like it's gone towards operations and consultants. In the conversations you and I have had, my fixation is the only way you get that, because that's completely opposite than our discussion before. Right now, costs are actually fairly high for those additional dollars. The adoption and the purchase of technology, the use of commercial databases to ping off to know something should dramatically lower your cost of collections and make your collections much more efficient, fair, open. Tell me the story. Am I off base? Is it we have to hire armies of people, or is technology my nirvana?
Well, first of all, I can assure you that investment in exam and audit has a positive return on investment.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm looking at the CBO's numbers and your own press release numbers. I'm getting basic division I'm pretty good at.
I'm happy to walk through the math with you.
I'd be happy to get your report.
To answer your question on the technology, it's essential. The whole effort underway is really about modernization. And it's at every level. Technology is going to help us process quicker and more efficiently, more accurately, and more securely. Technology is going to help taxpayers have an easier time with, it's going to take them less time to do their taxes and hopefully be less expensive.
So what can I do as the person here on this panel who's absolutely fixated? What do I do to help you get there?
Well, first of all, we appreciate your peer review of our technology plans. And I know my team has already briefed your team, but we should regularly...
And I have to, and I can't believe I'm saying your team has actually been great in communicating with me.
That doesn't surprise me. But my point is that we have a lot of different opportunities to advance technology at every level. Our website, the tools that taxpayers have.
The chat for calling.
The chat function,
And I wish at some point, I would love you to talk about your experiment last cycle and the expansion of that this tax season.
Yeah, we're adding chat functionality, whether it's automated chat, so you're talking to a computer, and then it advances. If the computer can't answer, it goes to live chat. These are standard activities in the private sector and in many other public sector call centers. We're just catching up. And we're catching up because we now have the funding to modernize versus just keep the lights on.
Is there, and if I'm wrong, don't tell me. Everyone else tells me I'm wrong. But that adoption of technology should dramatically change your structural cost of collections.
Correct.
And that's my hope, because on our side we fret over the $80 billion, and was it going to be hiring people, or was it going to be hiring efficiencies? And for my Democrat colleagues, it's going after wealthy people. But and I do look forward to your staff providing me, because you've taken in your own press release $520 million, and I see a cost from actually that press release and the Pasquale preliminary CBO audit of 5.7. The last thing I'm going to ask you, just because we get a lot of inbound on this, on the employer retention.
Yes.
I accept that's been just what it is. please, guidance as fast as you can, so whether it be the small business, whether it even be the promoters, everyone sort of knows what the rules are, knows what the timing is, and knows how to close this out. And I know you have to run things by armies of lawyers and those things. Buy them caffeine, get it done.
Let me just, if I could, we have a special section on irs.gov just on our ERC, what to look out for, do's and don'ts, why you might not be ineligible. We did a webinar on February 8th that had 8,000 registered participants, and we're running educational series all over the country. We're doing a lot. We obviously could doing more, and so we're willing to obviously listen to ideas about how we get out there and talk to people about this program and make the entire process clear.
I think the question is also the processing time, what's
Yes.
eligible, not eligible, and just when does it sort of get there. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Commissioner, let me welcome and thank you and the Internal Revenue Services for its outstanding success in ensuring a fairer tax system in which the wealthy and well-connected pay their fair share. I want to make you aware of the outstanding work of the Chicago Taxpayer Advocate Service. I am grateful for B.C. Olabaramio, Katrina Britt, Arlene Merritt, Fred Tavares, and the rest of the Chicago team who have used their expertise to help my constituents. I also thank Robert Chapman with the D.C. Legislative Affairs team for his assistance. As you may know, I helped champion many of the key 2021 EITC and CDCTC enhancements, like lowering the EITC age to 19 for all workers, or 18 for foster or homeless youth, and giving working parents up to $8,000 for child care expenses. I'd like to work with you to better understand the patterns in the use of those credits to inform efforts to restore them. For example, how many younger workers got the EITC in 2021 who are excluded under current law? Or how many foster homeless youth used their provisions? Or how many more working parents benefited from the refundable CDCTC who would not under current law? Do you have any updates you can share with us about who benefited and how from the 2021 Earned Income Tax Credit and CDCTC enhancements compared to other years? I'm proud that I helped lead the effort to make the VITA program permanent. I know that the Internal Revenue Services IRA Strategic Operating Plan Initiative 1.9 includes the goal of expanding the coverage and scope of the VITA and TCE-free tax preparation programs. Have any specific strategies been identified for accomplishing that goal, and how has the IRS involved VITA and TCE organizations in developing those strategies?
Thank you for those questions, Congressman. On your data question, we have now awareness of that question, and our research and analytics team is working to get you answer as quickly as possible. I will say, and I'll connect your first question to your second question, we know that there are people eligible for earned income tax credit that are not claiming eligibility. They're not claiming eligibility because they may not know about it. They might not be claiming eligibility because they're intimidated by the complexity of the eligibility formula. They just need help. And so we can do more outreach and working with community partners to make sure that people are aware of this benefit and are getting the help they need. You mentioned our volunteers for both underserved populations and the elderly. I would love to grow those programs, working with local communities on what we call taxpayer experience days, having more and more of those around the country with an educational campaign around what you may be eligible for, and then with free help available to sit with you and walk you through. I've been to one of these volunteer sites in Baltimore, and it's an amazing experience to witness these volunteers there with taxpayers who would not otherwise gotten the help they needed, and they're just very appreciative, and the volunteers are passionate about helping people get the benefits they're eligible for.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Commissioner Werfel, for being here today and for your service. I'm the chair of our subcommittee on work and welfare that oversees a number of different federal programs. One of those is child support. And I want to focus my questions on child support enforcement. And as you know, CSE program works with the IRS on collecting child support for non-custodial parents to help children and families to get the money that they deserve through your program, which is the Federal Tax Refund Offset Program. This is a vital source of income for millions of families across the country. In my home state of Illinois, 44,000 families and children depend on and receive $65 million through the Federal Tax Refund Offset Program. To service these families participating in this program, many states, 42 states in particular, rely on the federal tax information through third-party contractors, and that's the way it's been done since 2004. A year ago, without consultation to Congress and without us an opportunity to work with you on that, the IRS made the decision abruptly to change this policy, and this has caused a shift. Now all states and CSE programs that use contractors will be in non-compliance as of October. So we did a bipartisan hearing in November, and across the board, people were frustrated. They were extremely, there was lots of questions on why the IRS did this and why they're putting states in jeopardy on this. I'll give you an example. The Illinois Administrator of Child Support Services, Brian Tribble, he testified right where you were at to our subcommittee that this policy change by the IRS will cost Illinois hundreds of millions of dollars to implement new systems and hire employees. And furthermore, if states are unable to come into compliance in time by this October, their entire CSE program could be in jeopardy of losing federal matching funds, resulting in millions of families and children losing their child support payments. So what I'm trying to figure out, Commissioner, and I'd love your explanation on it, why this was done without consultation to Congress to put an equitable solution in place and possibly legislation to remedy this, and why was this sudden change done? If you can, and by the way, the stress and anxiety this is putting these 42 states through is immense.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And this was an issue that was brought to my attention very early in my tenure back in March of '23. And I, like you, had a lot of questions about the policy itself and why we had issued it. And I immediately engaged with the Department of Health and Human Services, who runs the child support program, to understand what the IRS could do to reset the expectation across states, contractors, and others. At this moment, that policy announcement is paused. We are not moving forward, and now we have the opportunity to do the very engagement that you are suggesting. So we have told HHS that we are going to take more time to make sure that that we've heard from stakeholders appropriately before we finalize any such policy.
So just to clarify, the pause that you just referenced, does that affect the October 24 deadline?
I believe it does, but I want to get back to you with more specifics.
Well, that's obviously very important.
Very
as people
important,
are coming
yes.
into compliance. I mean, do you have an estimate of how much this will cost states to come into compliance with this new policy?
I don't have it at my fingertips, but this is why it's so important to get this right.
I mean, and just another issue that is part of the collateral damage is there are 60 federally recognized Native American tribes that also fall into this category too. And they're in a much more tougher position because of some of the financial and economic issues there because of this IRS policy. And so they're in jeopardy of losing access to critical child support enforcement tool, those tribes. So I want to mention that to you, and this needs to be a priority for you and your department.
Yeah, I want to make this commitment to the extent, and I need to go back to the office and make sure that I have the details. We did pause to the extent it is intending to go back in October of 24, as you mentioned. I want to talk to you about the implications of that, and I'm happy to revisit that with you to make sure we're getting all the right data and feedback before we move forward.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Werfel, for testifying today. I want to join my colleagues in recognizing the hard work that the IRS employees, the Taxpayer Advocate Service, and other federal workers put in every day to help American workers, seniors, and families file their tax returns and claim the federal benefits that they've all earned. I also appreciate that many members of Congress share Democratic tax writers' commitment specifically to improving the child tax credit. Most of us recognize that the CTC is one of the most powerful tools for fighting poverty in this country, but we can all agree that the devil is in the details where that is concerned. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the dais disagree with congressional Democrats on how generous relief for working families should be. But as a mom and a legislator, I'm going to continue to fight to ensure that our nation's tax code benefits all households with children. And that means even parents or caregivers who don't even earn enough to owe and pay federal income taxes. I believe that they also deserve some financial relief. I was disappointed when my Republican tax writing colleagues killed the good faith amendment that Mr. Davis and I offered on the Wyden-Smith tax bill just a few weeks ago. Our amendment would have strengthened the bill by restoring full refundability for the child tax credit. We've all seen data showing that millions of children across the U.S. could benefit from even a modest expansion of the child tax credit. And I am specifically looking out for those families who earn so little that they can't claim this tax relief at all, even though they are raising children. Commissioner, I want to thank you again for answering our questions today. And I want to talk a little bit about something that was raised earlier about the deadbeat millionaires and billionaires who are cheating on their taxes and evading their responsibility to pay their fair share. I would say that I don't think anybody loves paying their taxes, but I think people do it if they feel like the system is fair and everybody pays their fair share. What would happen if middle-income and low-income Americans didn't pay their taxes or cheated on their taxes at the same rate that these millionaires and billionaires did? What would happen?
Well, I mean, the deficit would grow. I mean, the IRS, and you're right, paying your taxes isn't your favorite activity of the year, for sure. But we fund virtually the entire government through those tax collections. And in order to have a functioning government, whether you want that government big or small, the IRS needs to function effectively, and there needs to be equity in our tax system. Otherwise, people will lose trust, and trust is what our tax system is built on.
Now, when you say the revenues you get fund government, that means our defense, our national defense, correct?
It is everything that the government does, keeping our skies safe, so your air traffic controllers, your food safe. When you go to the restaurant and you have confidence that your children are eating food that's not going to make them sick, that's all government funding, and that's all made possible if we have a functioning tax system.
Now, if the IRS could collect what these deadbeat millionaires and billionaires and huge corporations actually owe, might we be able to pay for the child tax credit to be expanded or perhaps even fully refundable?
There's absolutely money being left on the table in terms of what is owed versus what is paid. And this is particularly an area of focus for high wealth taxpayers in complicated situations. And as I mentioned, When I arrived at the IRS, my question was, what are the gaps we need to close? Where are the gaps most problematic? And one of them was during our period of underfunding, we had lost pace with keeping up with these complex returns, and the risk of evasion had grown.
So if we could get these complex tax filers to pay their fair share, which I'm assuming are a lot of these big corporations that have different subsidiaries and different companies, and they move the money around, and these millionaires and billionaires that have sophisticated accountants and tax attorneys that can help them evade taxes, if we could collect what they owe, we could potentially expand or even make the child tax credit fully refundable so that kids and babies who go to bed hungry every night in this country would be lifted out of that hunger and lifted out of that poverty?
I leave it to the wisdom of Congress to decide how to use the money. I just want to make sure that tax returns are complete, accurate, and what is owed is what is paid.
I appreciate your testimony today, and I thank you for your answers, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today. Mr. Werfel, last November, 2 Democrat senators in press releases bragged about the pressure they put on you and the IRS to delay implementation of the new 1099-K threshold that passed in the partisan American Rescue Plan. Both of these senators previously voted in favor of the change. The Democrat senators also bragged about the IRS decision to change the threshold to $5,000, which it would seem to not have the authority to do so. With all due respect, Mr. Werfel, and I know you're in a tough job, but this looks like you're blatantly not enforcing the law and are also unilaterally changing the law because Senate Democrats in the current administration are having second thoughts about just how terrible this policy is that's been enacted. It is my job to provide oversight on this, and the American people do not trust this administration. And why would they, when this administration does not enforce a law that passed through a Democrat-controlled Congress and was signed by a Democrat president? Now that we are in an election year, President Biden's administration refuses to implement the law and unilaterally change the law in a favor because the law on the books is politically unfavorable and punitive to the average American. My colleagues will touch on this, have touched on this for you, but I want to ask you a question regarding the direct e-file program that's just been recently implemented. Isn't it true that private sectors provide free return preparation services outside of the government free file program?
Yes.
What's that estimate of how many they've done based on your data?
I don't know the exact number, but the free file program has been one of the central staples of how we provide free help to taxpayers.
So, but it's when you say it's free, we're actually having to fund that from your side, right? I mean, you don't have this just technology driven. It's not AI driven. It's driven with people in your offices that are actually administering this. You're
talking about the free file program or the direct file program? So the free file.
Free file. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we work with the Free File Alliance. These are commercial software providers that have signed on to help provide a path for eligible taxpayers to use their product for free to file their taxes. That is something, and there's resources that the IRS does to ensure that partnership is as successful as possible.
So on the direct e-file program that you're doing, you're
Yes.
competing directly with those corporations.
I don't see it as a competition. I see it as another option for taxpayers.
So if you're saying that these services are provided by corporations, free, and others that are doing business, so we have it there. And so when you say it's free to the American people, you're saying you're providing these services internally, doesn't cost you anything, there's no taxpayer dollars used in your organization for administrative costs to do this?
No, there is a cost, and we've been public about what the potential and cost would be. The goal is to provide taxpayers with options and to help the taxpayers pick the solution for filing taxes that's best for them. Some will file in paper. We encourage them to file electronically. Some will hire an accountant. Some will go to the commercial software and pay. Some will go to the commercial software and try to work that for free. And what we heard from taxpayers, and we heard it pretty loudly, was that there was an interest in having an option where they could file directly with the IRS for free. And we wanted to test
But-
whether that option was
Mr.
viable. and
Werfel,
that's
with
what
all
we're
due
doing.
respect, isn't that the sort of the old phrase that Ronald Reagan used, "We're from the government, we're just here to help"? I mean, it's not free. I mean, listen, we've given you billions of dollars. This is not free for you to provide this service to American people. When I know it might be shocking, but from the data we've gotten from these commercial companies that you've described, somewhere 29 million tax returns been filed through the direct for the free file program that they have out there. And so I just, or the direct e-file program rather, just want to make sure that, you know, again, everybody thinks if the government does it, it's free. It's not free if the government provides these services. It is costing taxpayer dollars to provide that.
Yeah, so here's how I would answer that. I would change the President Reagan statement a little bit. We're from the government, and here's an option. And if you don't want to use the option, you don't need to. And we're just piloting it this year, a small-scale pilot. So what's going to happen is we'll evaluate what was the cost, what was the experience, is there a demand for taxpayers? Do taxpayers want the IRS to provide this option?
Yeah, Mr. Werfel, all due respect, you know, I've only been up here 5.5 years, and this is the age-old thought, and this is long before you got into government and I got into government. Everybody wants to talk about the federal government having money that it really doesn't. It has taxpayer dollars that funds our government. I think we would agree with that. So we're using, I think it ought to be described, it's not free, it's funded by other taxpayers and them as well. If they're using the service, if they qualify, my guess is I don't know what the criteria is, but my guess is to qualify for that program is that they're probably not paying taxes and it's a refundable credit that they're getting in many cases. But I'm just saying it's not free. And we should say it's paid for by taxpayer dollars. And you know, this misnomer that we get government services for free is just not true. It's disingenuous. I yield back.
Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here today so that we can talk about the very important relationship between taxpayers and the IRS. Tax seasons can be very stressful for millions of American families and small businesses, and I'm happy that we're taking important steps today to highlight tax filing experiences that have resulted in a more sensible, fair, and more efficient process. The road to this point has been a long one. The IRS has had their work cut out for them with a very long list of major implementation issues over the last decade. But today I'm glad to hear that the IRS, through the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, is improving its interactions with the public. Last year, in this very same setting, you and I were able to discuss the well-documented reports over the last few filing seasons that recipients of the Earned Income Tax Credit face significantly higher audit rates than other taxpayers. These findings were discussed in detail, and I appreciate our colloquy. EITC audits are more heavily concentrated in the southeast of the United States and including many of the counties that I represent in Alabama's rural and underserved Black Belt. In fact, Greene County, Alabama, in my district, was among the 10 most audited counties in the country for EITC recipients. And I venture to guess that the median income for a family of 4 in Greene County is less than $30,000 a year. Since our conversation last year, you penned a letter to Congress in September of 2023 mentioning the administration of additional steps and an initial round of changes that have been made regarding the audit process for EITC. I do believe accountability is a direct result of transparency, and with that, the opportunity to ask you whether or not this initial round of changes that you highlighted in the letter to Congress has resulted in less audits on underserved communities.
It will. I want to start by saying it is, there are certain solemn responsibilities that the IRS has that we have to meet our mission. We have to meet our mission in a way that avoids disparate impact. And in this case, there was evidence that our audits in Earned Income Tax Credit was having a disparate impact on Black taxpayers. And we have to first acknowledge it, and now we have to fix it. And one of the significant things that independent study reported was driving the disparity was the volume of EITC audits. So one of the key things we've announced is a significant and dramatic reduction in the number of EITC audits plan for this coming tax year as a way to address it. We also are testing changes in the audit selection algorithm that we have a hypothesis will remediate the disparate impact that has been occurring. And it'll take a little bit of time to validate that. We hope to update that, maybe in the fall, where we have more data, to make sure that we're reporting publicly that the steps we took had the impact that we wanted it to have.
Well, I will definitely be awaiting such a report. I think it's really important that we don't target certain populations, especially those that are underserved populations, and for something as important but not often claimed like the Earned Income Tax Credit. So I look forward to working with you in any way I can to help address this issue. As you rightfully said, it is disproportionately affecting African American taxpayers, and it really is unacceptable in this day and age. So I thank you for your candor, and I look forward to working with you to see if we can reduce those numbers.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Werfel, Commissioner. I'm actually okay with audits. We want people to pay their taxes, and there should be a random way of selecting some tax returns to ensure that there's an incentive for people to comply. I do want to, however, get your thinking about some statements that you made this morning. You've multiple times talked about high-income earners, you've talked about millionaires and billionaires, you've talked about complex tax returns in the same sentence as tax avoidance and tax evasion. Do you believe that millionaires and billionaires are all tax cheats?
I do not.
Do you believe that there is a reason for complex returns other than to avoid taxes?
Absolutely, there is.
What would be some of those reasons?
Well, here's my understanding, that CFOs of major companies, they have a responsibility to their board and to their shareholders to find the most tax advantage status. The concern, and they should.
So it would be a problem for you if they took a legitimate tax deduction?
No, if their return is accurate and complete and legitimate, great. But that's not the concern that we have. That's not the issue. The issue was that because the IRS was not auditing our audit rates were anemic, because we weren't investing in keeping pace, that these efforts in certain cases got to aggressive avoidance and then even evasion. And I can give you examples of where it's more prolific, and that's really where we want to focus. It's where these efforts
it's troubling to me when you keep using those terms in the same sentence as if all high-income earners, who, by the way, are paying most of our taxes, are all looking to avoid taxes, because that's not my experience with business owners, with corporate leaders. They want to do what's right. And so, it concerns me going into an audit. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty, and if your entire organization is taking the approach that you're taking today, you're actually feeling that people are guilty before the audit is even done.
It was not my intention. My intention is to make sure we're increasing scrutiny on complex returns where there's high risk of evasion.
Do you have any information on what percentage of returns on high-income earners result in no change?
I can get that information for you. I don't have that at my fingertips.
Do you have any information regarding the change rate after audits in all income earners levels? For instance, we know there's been fraud in those who receive the child tax credit. What percentage of individuals who have filed for the child tax credit have done it so fraudulently compared to high-income earners? Do you have that information?
I believe we have that and can get that to you.
Yeah, could you share that with all of us? And I want to caution you. I have a lot of people who do very well and are proud to be part of America and proud to pay their taxes, and they don't want to hear from the IRS Commissioner that he thinks that all of them are cheats. So I'd caution you in the language.
Well, I would love to go on the record and say I do not believe all of them are cheats, but I do get bothered when we see evidence of evasion
In your testimony, you've also characterized partnerships in the same way. That's deeply disturbing. You've said an increased audits of partnerships is important because apparently in your mind, partnerships for some reason are a category that is cheating more than others.
Congressman, what we're trying to do actually is bring our audit rate back to historical norms. It's been anemic, and I do believe that when we're not doing the requisite amount of audits, when we're not showing that we are ready to enforce, that does increase the risk of evasion, and that's what we're focused on.
You know, it's to the Congressman Sewell just mentioned targeting specific populations. I think that should go across the board.
I agree.
I don't want IRS to target any population. I think in all categories, most people want to pay their taxes and are doing their best to comply with the law. And so I
agree with that.
I hope what you're doing is a randomized targeting, a randomized looking at audits or at returns to ensure that everyone is complying to the best of your ability.
We're looking for spaces where we think evasion is proliferating and trying to hold people accountable for what they owe. Too many of these organizations are shielding their income. That doesn't mean they all are. That means that there's more work to do for the IRS to make sure people are paying what they owe.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Werfel, thank you for being here today. I want to start with doing something that we probably don't do a lot on this side. I want to thank you for your help. When you were here last time, you gave me your word that if we sent some tough cases that had no movement, that you would help with those, and thank you for doing that. I have another long list that I may just send your way because when you speak, the rank and file under you seem to move. So, just wanted to say thank you for the help on those other cases. Two things I want to touch on. Number one, the problems in the employee retention tax credit have been well documented and well discussed here today. This committee, in a bipartisan way, along with the House, passed a pretty significant piece of legislation the other day, and at the heart of it was dealing with the employee retention tax credit. Can you speak to how important that legislation was into preventing the fraud and helping the IRS work through the legitimate claims on that? Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I mean, it's the legislation that's under consideration, for example, that would prohibit ERC claims from coming in after a date certain. And one of the things that impacts our ability to make sure that we're getting to the eligible claims amongst the ineligible is the size of the inventory. And the more our inventory is flooded with ineligible claims, and right now, we're still, once we issued the moratorium, the influx of claims dropped in half, but it's still, I think we got 17 to 20,000 last week. So we're still, that inventory is growing, and it's growing with a lot of ineligibility. So we're helping us pause the incoming at this point so we can find those that have submitted that are eligible. We need that help.
And so again, stating that the legislation that we passed could provide a significant savings to the American taxpayer.
I believe that.
Thank you for that. Next item, and my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, touched on this, and as he was talking about it, I said, I think he looked over here and looked at my notes. You know, we talk an awful lot on this committee about, and we debate going back and forth with these complex corporate tax returns and high-income earners. But we know that there's a tremendous amount of fraud in the earned income tax credit space, child tax credit space. If you had to look at what you think the corporate fraud is versus the total dollar amount on the earned income tax credit and child tax credit, either through improper payments or fraud, how do those two numbers compare?
Well, I actually think they're both important. I don't have the side-by-side ledger in front of me.
Okay, all right. So, but they're both important.
Both material.
All right. So you have said that you need money to beef up audits for partnerships, complex tax cases where evasion is more likely, right? Okay. How much effort are you putting into, and would you recommend that we look at reforming the tax preparer space and going after the folks that actually are committing fraud at the lower end of the income spectrum.
Yeah,
If they're both there, I haven't heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they have been railing against corporate America and high income earners, but they lack the same religion when it comes to going after people that cheat the system in the earned income tax credit space.
I'll tell you, Congressman, what's very motivating, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks, protecting honest taxpayers who are being victimized and the tax system using them to victimize. So the example that drives me crazy, and I want to make sure that we address it, is a nefarious preparer who coaxes an innocent taxpayer in, promises them an earned income tax credit quickly, whereas they could get it just as quickly from us, and then rips them off in some way, shape, or form.
Sure, the predatory lending practices that go along with this are pretty grotesque. And, you know, I would love to work with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle on a really meaningful piece of bipartisan legislation that goes after the folks that really are committing the fraud at the lower end of the spectrum. It's important. Look, I'm sort of like my friend from Pennsylvania here. We want the IRS to do its job. We believe that audits are important, but they should be fair and they should be non-discriminatory, and they should be at both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah,
So
understood. And that's a first principle we have. We want, just like with the high income, where there's nefarious activity, for sure, where there's blatant disregard and purposeful evasion, for sure. And at the lower end of the income bracket, when we have nefarious actors like the one I just described, that's where I'd like to focus, rather than an audit program that impacts too many honest taxpayers. And I'll go back to this, with the right investments, we can be more surgical.
Look, what you just said, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm over my time, but when you got to have a program that's fair for everybody. You talk about just going after the preparers, you have to also go after the individuals that are knowingly defrauding the system. And with that, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Thank you for the indulgence.
Thank you. Ms. Del Bene?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for being with us today. After years of neglect through decreased appropriations, the IRS finally received the influx of resources it needed to improve and update its operations. In the year and a half since the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law, we've seen the impact of these resources. Some of these successes include call time responses decreasing from 28 minutes to 3 minutes, the backlog of 2022 individual returns now cleared, and launching new digital tools to help taxpayers. Yet, unfortunately, Republicans want to continue getting the agency's funding, so we should be ensuring the IRS has multi-year sustained funding to continue building on these successes. Mr. Commissioner, I wanted to know if you could speak to the IRS's enhanced enforcement efforts and specifically how the use of AI is helping to identify non-compliant taxpayers.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. And we have to make investments to make sure that we are precisely finding where the evasion is most problematic. And in particular, in these complex situations, for example, with money moving across international jurisdictions, money moving into wholly owned subsidiaries, it can be tough to find where the evasion is. And we can invest in AI-powered analytics to really better understand and increase the likelihood that we're seeing the evasion and selecting the right cases for audit. And so that's where these investments are going, into making more sophisticated models to make sure we're selecting the right cases and finding the evasion where it is.
Thank you. One of the issues I've heard about from my constituents is about the lack of clarity on IRS notices that are sent to taxpayers. Often the notices are very complex. They're from the IRS, so people are very concerned about them. They leave taxpayers confused about how to resolve the issue. So what are some of the changes the IRS is implementing to the notices and letters that are sent to taxpayers? How can these changes benefit taxpayers? And how has IRA funding facilitated these reforms, if it has?
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important piece of the puzzle. We've launched what we call the Simple Notice Initiative. We send about 170 million letters or notices to taxpayers each year. And if you look at them, they need a lot of improvement in terms of their clarity. And we've run a program. In the last year, we took 31 high-volume notices, redesigned them, and they're significantly better, and we're getting very positive results on these. And now heading into 2025, we're now scaling. And so by next filing season, so when I'm sitting here next year, if we're successful, 90% of the total volume of notices will have gone through this effort and be redesigned and simplified. And we anticipate that's going to be very beneficial for taxpayers. In some of the early results that we're seeing, taxpayers are going to our online tools and using them more than calling in the call center. That means they're getting faster responses. So very positive results just from clarifying what we're asking taxpayers to do in these notices.
No, hugely important, and so thank you for that. Also, federal and state laws require professionals like doctors and lawyers to not only obtain licenses or certifications, but also to pass competency tests. And while some tax return preparers must meet licensing requirements, many tax return preparers do not have minimum competency requirements and therefore are not credentialed. Commissioner, I was wondering how taxpayers who use non-credentialed preparers are harmed by doing so, and how would establishing minimum competency standards help protect taxpayers?
Yeah, this has come up a few times in the hearing. We do have a risk with preparers that are not serving their clients well or their customers well. In some cases, just not providing appropriate and suitable tax advice. In some cases, actually stealing from them, or in some cases, leaving them with a financial mess on their hands. And so more can be done. And we have, the administration has put into the president's budget previously changes that would allow us to require more credentialing of these preparers before they would be able to provide tax advice or preparation services. I think it's an important thing because people are being victimized, and as I said earlier, one step the IRS can take in partnership with Congress to show that we're on the side of taxpayers is disrupting those moments of victimization. And this is an idea, an initiative that could do just that.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Estes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Commissioner Werfel for joining us today. I mean, we're 60 days out from Tax Day 2024. The Kansans I represent are working through their tax season tasks, whether it's preparing to file their individual tax returns or filing business forms. I mean, the fact is everybody has to interact with the IRS. An agency really should have a customer-focused prerogative that puts American people first and not the own interest within the agency. I'm also concerned about, like my colleagues here, about some of the inflammatory accusations that certain groups of Americans are automatically considered to be tax cheats. My career prior to running for office was looking at how do we provide good customer service, how do we make business operations more efficient. And unfortunately, it seems like a lot of the DC bureaucracies focus more on how to make things easier to push paper or work from Johnny's desk to Sally's desk, instead of focusing on how to be more efficient and meet the needs of American taxpayers and any constituents and provide that quality, timely service. Mr. Commissioner, I'm sure this doesn't surprise you, but my office in Wichita receives calls each year from constituents who have issues with the IRS. I mean, just this month I received a letter from a small car dealership, issues e-filing their 1099 NECs by January 31st deadline through the Information Retrieval Intake System, or the IRIS. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this letter from Luber's Cars for the record.
Without objection.
You know, the controller at Luber's Car told my office that while they started in the middle of the month, the e-filing and IRIS portal continued to crash, causing major delays and pushing them right up to the deadline. But the situation was not unique to Luber's Cars, who assured me that they have the top-of-the-line high-speed internet. They reached out to the Kansas Automobile Dealers Association, who informed them it was a widespread issue. Luber's tried the portal at multiple times during the workday and evening with no avail. The CPA indicated that they were receiving calls as well. Finally, around 6 a.m. on January 31st, the deadline, they successfully were able to submit the required 1099 NECs. Commissioner, as you know, the next deadline is March 31st. Are you aware of these issues with the IRS portal, and what are you doing to make sure that this critical tool is ready for the upcoming heavy usage as more small businesses file, now that you've got this money to have these upgraded systems?
It's a great question, and it's definitely on my radar screen. It was concerning while it was going on. This is, we have a lot of different portals, tools, technology out there, and anyone who's involved in running these systems will let you know that they don't always perform perfectly. The key is what your reaction time, your speed, your troubleshooting is, and when it happens, do you learn from it so that you prevent that type of mistake from happening in the future? And that's what I'm trying to instill in the IRS. And so we were working the problem, are working the problem, made the necessary adjustments to allow these information returns to be submitted successfully. We are monitoring it very closely because of what you said, and I'm cautiously optimistic that the changes and the updates that we made will allow for a much more stable platform as we get to the busy season.
Well, the Ubers controller called the IRS help desk multiple times and couldn't get through. You said earlier you've hired 5,000 new call agents to help with that, and so this letter is just less than 2 weeks ago. And so have all IRS agencies, employees returned to the office for 5-day work weeks since COVID? I know the GAO issued a report this fall that high percentages of offices across all agencies, not just the IRS, had not returned to the office. And what are you going to do, or what are you doing to help make sure that taxpayers who are trying to do the right thing can get through to work with your agents and other employees?
Yeah, so first clarify, all IRS employees are working. The objective is to make sure that we're getting the mission done. And when you tell me that someone didn't get through on the phone line, I want to learn more about that and figure out what we need to do. There is a government-wide standard out there in terms of where we stand today, what should be the percentage of in-office work versus remote work. The IRS is generally consistent with that government-wide standard, but we're constantly evaluating any steps that we can take.
Sorry to interrupt, but what is that, before I run out of time, what is that governmental standard for the IRS for the number of employees?
Well, the government-wide
to be in the
standard
office
is 50% is the government-wide standard.
So 60% of the employees come to the
everyone's
office.
working, it's 50% on-site versus 50% working in some remote location.
So how can somebody in a remote location be handling its tax returns? That just seems to me that it's not doing the job that needs to be done to help service American constituents.
Well, I'm happy to walk you through in greater detail, but we have many, many employees on site doing the exact work that you described. And in our campuses, where a lot of our processing of taxes goes, that's where we have heavy presence of IRS employees.
Thank you, and my time's run out. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal, and thank you, Commissioner, for agreeing to appear here today. I've been looking forward to discussing the IRS's actions with you for some time. I'm extremely concerned that the IRS has been just a little too focused on following political directions of the Biden administration instead of fulfilling its congressionally mandated duties. The continued delay of the 1099K threshold, an announcement of a new threshold, is an illegal overreach that is not found anywhere in law. Unfortunately, this is just another step in a long string of illegal and questionably legal actions taken by the IRS and the Department of Treasury to either willfully ignore the change or misinterpret the laws that have been passed by Congress. Why was the IRS unable to implement the $600 1099K threshold passed in the American Rescue Act?
I'm really glad I have an opportunity to respond to this question, Congresswoman. I believe the IRS Commissioner has the authority to implement laws in a manner that ensures taxpayer rights. This means that at times, implementation is delayed or ramped up over time in order to make sure that we're achieving that balance, that we're implementing the law that was enacted by Congress, but also abiding by another responsibility we have under the law, and that is to protect taxpayer rights. In this situation, this outcome of delay or ramped implementation was strongly recommended by a diverse set of stakeholders across tax industry, commercial industry. From every direction, we were hearing calls to that there was risk.
Well, I can understand why.
Yeah.
I mean, given the 3-year extended delay, does the IRS believe it will ever be able to comply with this law?
We're working with stakeholders on a path that will get it done, and in particular, that's why we are intending to begin implementation next year. Again, the focus that I have and we have at the IRS is how do we do this in the best interest of taxpayers? We don't want taxpayers overpaying their taxes. We don't want them confused. We don't want them bombarded with forms and paper they shouldn't be receiving. And if we go forward with implementation without being able to adequately protect against that risk, then I'm not meeting my legal responsibility as commissioner to help taxpayers and to help protect their rights.
Well, in November of 2023, you announced plans for a threshold of $5,000 in 2024. Yes. Who specifically made that decision to set this new threshold?
That was a strong recommendation from the stakeholders we reached out to across a variety of stakeholders, taxpayers, these companies that are third-party payment platforms. The reason why there seemed to be consensus on $5,000 was because that, if you looked at the analysis and the model, $5,000 would ensure the most revenue would be impacted while also protecting the most taxpayers from unnecessary paperwork and sending them things that they didn't actually need.
Well, I have to reclaim my time because, I mean, what authority does the IRS have to set the new threshold? The authority.
So we have an authority under the code to administer laws consistent with taxpayer rights. And so this happens from time to time. Our goal and our objective is to implement the laws on day one.
Yes,
there are many.
We write the laws.
Yes,
Congress writes the laws.
But
you don't.
There are a variety of examples throughout history where the IRS, in order to protect taxpayers from undue burden or from potentially being overtaxed, where we have either delayed implementation or ramped implementation. This is not the first time, and I'm not the first commissioner that has confronted this tension.
But they're still illegal. Your actions are still illegal.
It's not illegal to take a step to protect taxpayer rights.
Well, anyway, I'll move on from this. Another concerning action I have that the IRS has taken is the implementation of the so-called free file program. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. Nothing is free. Everything the U.S. government does is paid by taxpayer dollars. So nothing is ever free, and I don't think you should be wasting your millions of dollars when the private industry is doing a good job. But I do want to give you credit where credit is due. I commend the IRS where credit for the ERTC claims, for processing them. I understand that the system was devastated by fraud and abuse, which is why the committee and the House recently passed the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act in an overwhelmingly bipartisan manner. And I also want to urge my Senate colleagues to similarly follow suit so that the IRS can focus on credible ERTC claims so that good American small businesses can swiftly access the benefits that have been promised by Congress. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
The gentlelady yields back. I yield to Mrs. Moore from Wisconsin. You're recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for joining us today. We've heard a lot of discussion today about the earned income tax credit and the audits and the perhaps fraud that's been committed, and you were unable to sort of monetize the amount of fraud that was as compared to corporate fraud and loss of revenue. I guess we've had estimates that there's, like, at minimum, close to maybe $600 billion to $1 trillion worth of lost income from corporations. Is that anything, even though you can't nail it down to the penny, is that anything close to what you're experiencing with the earned income tax credit? Just sort of a back of the envelope sort of assessment?
So we have a tax gap analysis where we can evaluate where the differences are between what is paid versus what is owed. And the last estimate that we provided estimated at roughly $650 billion a year
Yeah.
in this gap.
So are you guessing that maybe the earned income tax credit fraud or whatever, and I'm sure you can recover all of it since it's not very complicated to catch an earned income tax problem. You don't even need a person, probably the machine will find that. Am I right or wrong about that?
Well, Congresswoman, for me, it's about priorities.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
what are our priorities within earned income tax credit program integrity, and what are our priorities in terms of tax evasion amongst the wealthy? And that's what I'm seeking to establish.
Okay, so let me go on because I hadn't really planned to talk about this. It's just that my colleagues have raised it. What would you say that the fraud rate for the earned income tax credit is as compared to the low uptake of it? The numbers of people who deserve it and could use it and don't apply for it is. What is that number?
Yeah, and again, I don't have the specific fraud rate. It's not something that we measure.
It's not fraud. I'm talking about the people who don't even
Exactly.
claim it.
And this is part of the challenge. We believe that there is a material gap in the
I
number.
mean, there's millions of dollars left on the table.
Agreed.
I think that families and kids need, particularly since we have such a stingy child tax credit. You know, we have harsh requirements for TANF, and people are leaving money on the table with the earned income tax credit. You know, I think, I believe it was my good colleague that asked you a question about child support. And I think that in the absence of an adequate child tax credit and earned income tax credit low uptake in that it's really important that we do child support tax collections. And I understand that these contractors have to be 6103 compliant. But we found this problem even with states that administer the child tax credit for tribes. And so I am wondering, you know, they're subject to these audits, and I'm wondering how long that's going to go on. It's really hurting tribal communities and not getting these monies. Can you quickly comment?
Well, I want to work with tribal communities directly. I know that tribal communities face unique challenges in terms of meeting their tax responsibilities or getting access to tax benefits. So if I can learn more about the specific issue,
That's right. Just learn about sovereignty, and that'll help you figure it out. Let me ask you some questions before my time expires. Very quick questions. I'm not asking you to opine on policy, okay?
Yes.
I'm just asking you to affirm some things that I think I already know. This essential government function test, is that an impediment to tribal nations' use of government bonds? Yes or no?
I know it's something that that is more in a policy shop, but I do
know,
believe.
I'm just saying.
I'm saying this is what we've heard from tribal communities, and that's why it's important to engage with them on solutions.
So
to the
same
issues.
thing, because they're going to cut me off, I guarantee you. The new market tax credit set aside for tribes, the low-income housing tax credits, and, you know, setting aside a housing tax credit program, would that increase the effectiveness and administrability of these programs from the perspective of the IRS?
It's something that I want to work with and coordinate with Treasury and the tribal outreach programs that they do and get back to you on that.
Well, Commissioner, just let me join the chairman, the ranking member, all of my colleagues in thanking you for being here and being you've been very good, and I want to appreciate you.
And Congresswoman, I do now know that 20% of eligible taxpayers don't claim the earned income tax credit. So that means 1 in 5, and that is something we have to address.
That's a lot of money
Yes.
that's left on the table.
Absolutely.
Versus how many frauds that you find. And of course, you can collect every dime of that money because it's not hard to audit an EITC recipient versus someone who has 500 corporations and billions of dollars. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
I gave you an extra 53 seconds. You just remember that.
I'm going to remember that.
Helping you out. All right, the gentlelady yields back. Mr. Murphy from North Carolina, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for coming today. I was just looking at your CV. I saw you went to Duke and to UNC.
I did.
So if you can answer one question today, Duke or UNC?
Duke.
All right, well, I got no more to say to you. All right, let's get down, actually. So questions. California and North Carolina, New York have the most billionaires. And you're saying that that's a high rate of cheating. Have you ever correlated any of them with are they paying the California taxes and the New York taxes?
I don't have that analysis at my fingertips. We're focusing.
No, what I'm saying is because we're talking about a lot of folks not paying their taxes. Look, I'm 100%. People need to pay their taxes, period. I don't care what income bracket you're in. But if we're talking about millionaires and billionaires not paying their fair share, which is what we hear the president say a lot, those are the two biggest states are in California and New York. So it'd be nice to know, you don't have to answer this, but it'd be nice to know, are they doing that for New York and California, and are their particular revenue departments going after them? Fair question.
It is a fair question, and I would, I would want to coordinate a response to that after talking to those states. We are not necessarily focused regionally. We're focused on the types of evasions
I get it.
that corporations are engaged in. Many of them are maybe operating in California, incorporated in Delaware. The reality is that the question is the underlying behavior.
Okay, all right, thanks. Were you aware that the Biden administration has said that TikTok is not to be allowed on government devices?
I am aware of that, yes.
All right, so this is just very troubling to me. So the OMB issued guidance February 27, 2023, agencies were how to implement this law. DIGA found that 23 devices used by IRS still had access to TikTok, and this is still troubling. It took the IRS, this thing was issued, TIGTA issued this to the IRS in May. The IRS did not take action until August of 2023. Why?
I'm not sure of the facts of that, but that does seem unacceptable, and I will get to the bottom of it.
Do you personally believe, I think there are many members of Congress, especially over in the Senate, Democratic Senator Intelligence, Senator Warner, believes that TikTok is a security risk to this country.
Yeah,
so I'm just saying this is his word. It's generally considered a risk, and I just, to the life of me, don't understand why these are still on devices. What really bothers me, we're talking about folks working from home, is that the bring your own device policy for the IRS is still not enforcing this ban on TikTok. Can you speak to that?
Well, I want to make sure I understand the TIGTA recommendation and where we are in closing it out, but I absolutely agree. Whether people are working remotely or working on site, we have to abide by these security standards, and any lapse cannot be tolerated. So we need to be.
It took 8 months for the IRS to really update this policy. That's not acceptable. It wouldn't be acceptable in business. It shouldn't be acceptable in any government agency. Let me ask you about the Criminal Investigation Unit and their access to TikTok, because it seems that they're kind of trying to get a waiver for this. Are you aware of any of that?
I am aware of the fact that that in certain cases, when our law enforcement division is working to impede, disrupt, and hold accountable criminal enterprises, sometimes they have to use tools that to understand and solve those crimes. So it's not, it's a kind of an apple and an orange versus an IRS employee who should not have TikTok on their device versus a law enforcement official who's using.
Are you aware of that requisite, of that asking for this, for the Criminal Investigation Unit to have a waiver?
I would want to get, before I got into more detail, I'd want to go back and get more detail, but I am aware of that, yes.
Yeah, would you mind getting back to my office about
Yes.
that? It's Murphy from North Carolina, who's a big Tar Heel fan. And by the way,
Yeah, I
Shefsky
really
lost
am
his
going to
last
regret
game.
that answer. I just was at UNC speaking, and I feel affinity there, but it's a long story.
I'm messing with you. I'm messing with you. Just one last question. Artificial intelligence. You know, this is the gold rush for this country and the world for that matter. Bias, absolute bias, will be a thing we're going to have to fight. And I hope that given some of the biases that have been stated by the department, some individuals, that I have your commitment to do your very, very best that the IRS does not have any biases when using artificial intelligence and looking at who to audit, who not to audit, because we saw that going after Republicans before. We saw some real problems with who were audited. And artificial intelligence is a tool, but it should not be used as a political weapon in the IRS.
You have my commitment.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Next, Mr. Kufsoff, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for appearing today. I'd like to go back, if I can, please, to the GAO report that Congressman Estes was asking about. This is the one dated July 13th, 2023. The title of it is Preliminary Results Show Federal Buildings Remain Underutilized Due to Longstanding Challenges and Increased Telework. If I can, just let me read maybe 2 sentences. 17 of the 24 federal agencies in GAO's review used an estimated average 25% or less of their headquarters building capacity in a 3-week sample period across January, February, and March of 2023. On the higher range, agencies used an estimated 39 to 49% of the capacity of their headquarters on average. Do you know on an average day, Commissioner, how much of your headquarters building is being used?
In Washington, I don't have that number at my fingertips.
Would you say it's less than 50%?
It may be because, as I mentioned earlier, overall, the IRS is roughly in line with the government-wide standard of 50%. So because it's an average, it may be under.
We've heard different things and questions today to you from members. Anecdotally, subjectively, what I hear from my staff and from CPAs and practitioners that have to reach the IRS is that it's a real struggle to get a hold of somebody. And you talked about earlier some of the challenges with the phone, the callback, which I appreciate.
Yes.
I would contend, respectfully, that not having employees in the office and having them work remotely presents challenges not only to your agency, but to the people that have to interact with it. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that it depends on what the function is. There are moments, for example, when whether it's a weather event, streets are shut down, we don't want to lose productivity. So we set people up to be able to work remotely where they can. I would also...
I get if there's a weather situation, but if we're talking about a day where the weather is fine, wouldn't it make more sense from a productivity standpoint to have employees physically present at the IRS than working remotely?
In some cases, yes. In other cases, it's less relevant. I can give you examples of where it's highly relevant.
Yep.
For example, in our taxpayer assistance centers, those are our walk-in centers, and those are fully staffed 5 days a week. Everyone's there at all times. Also, if you visited, and you're all invited to come to one of our campus locations, and you'll see those campuses teaming with employees that are opening envelopes and doing other things to manage the tax system. And those individuals have to be on site, and they are on site.
Well,
for me, what I look at is...
You've had a number of questions here about security. We're all concerned about it. I know you're concerned about it, whether it's Mr. Littlejohn or whatever, as it relates to taxpayer information. From a security standpoint, wouldn't it be safer and more secure to have taxpayer information accessed at an IRS office versus an IRS employee's home?
There are steps that you can take to ensure appropriate security, whether the employee is in a SCIF, in a non-SCIF, or remote. And we have to make sure that we're securing, because there may be situations, whether it's a weather event or otherwise, or a pandemic, where we have to ensure the right level of security regardless of where the employee is.
It's a true statement that IRS employees, when they are working remotely from home, can access taxpayer information, right?
Certain employees, depending on the need, yes.
Nothing to prevent the employee's 19-year-old son walking behind the screen from taking a screenshot of whatever's on the screen, correct?
That would be a violation of that employee's responsibility to protect information. There would be significant consequences for that, and therefore, virtually all IRS employees are very rigid in how taxpayer information is handled, whether it's handled on their computer screen in a remote location or on an IRS site.
But it's true that that situation wouldn't occur if that employee were in the office, right?
That, I don't want to engage in hypotheticals, but that
Well,
one, that doesn't make sense.
That employee's
Yeah.
19-year-old son would not be
Correct.
physically,
But
right?
there could be a visitor in the building. That's why it's so important that whether you're on site or you're at home, that you are extraordinarily careful about who has visibility to information that you're the only person who should have
And
visibility.
I can cite other examples, just like I did about the 19-year-old son in the home. There's no doubt, though, that situation wouldn't occur if that employee were in the office, in the IRS office, correct?
What I'm suggesting is
Yeah,
hypothetical.
can you-
I don't want to
would you
engage in
answer yes or no,
hypotheticals.
and then I'll allow you to finish the
I feel like it's dangerous to go into hypotheticals, because then someone's
not a
going to turn
hypothetical.
around and ask me, what if someone has a take your daughter to work day and they're walking through the office? So there are all these situations. My common denominator bottom line is that each employee must rigidly and relentlessly protect that information from unauthorized access from any 19-year-old, whether they're visiting their parent in the office or whether they're at home.
Let the record show that you were non-responsive. Thank you, Commissioner.
Fair enough.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Schneider is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner Werfel, for joining us today. I want to start by saying I have appreciated working with you and your staff, who have been very helpful with us in dealing with our constituent questions. Before I go to a question, let me touch briefly on casework. We've been in touch with your team on a handful of IRS cases that we've been unable to make headway as we were hoping. Can I just get a commitment that we'll continue to work on these to try to
Absolutely.
get them done? And I will go back to the previous. My kids are now 29 and 30, and I worked before coming to Congress with a lot of confidential client information. Whether my kids were visiting me in the office, as they often did, or I was working at home, as I often did, it was imperative that I kept that information confidential. And I think what I heard you saying is that that's the expectation of IRS employees, that information is kept confidential irrespective of where they are, who might be visiting.
One of the reasons why I was struggling with the question and the hypothetical is I don't want to signal to any IRS employee that they can let their guard down no matter where they are, whether they're at home, whether they're at the office. It's absolutely critical that we have rigid policies and procedures in place to prevent unauthorized access.
Right.
And that's what I really want to emphasize.
Thank you. I just want to make that clear. Let me also, I'll take another minute. We've talked about the IRA and the impact it's had, and you've touched on some of the things, but the handful of things, I'll let you reiterate them, that the progress made. There's been discussion of here saying it's not quite perfect, but I'm going to focus on progress, not perfection. Where's the progress we've made over the last
things are
couple years?
trending in the right direction. I don't think there's any way that I will rest and come up to this table and say we're done. We're not done. And I want to hear about the taxpayer concerns. But I also want to recognize the before and after of a funded tax agency versus a non-funded tax agency. And the before and after is stark in terms of what we're able to deliver in terms of taxpayer service. And that means if we're funded, our walk-in centers are open. We can have Saturday hours. We can have special events where we're training people about how to use their, how to get free assistance. Webinars are in place. All these different resources that we can invest in reaching out to taxpayers and helping them meet their tax responsibility.
Is the difference of 85% of calls going unanswered and 85% of calls now
Exactly.
being answered?
Exactly. And the other thing that I haven't had a chance to emphasize as much as I'd like to is the before and after of being funded in terms of what we can do to protect honest taxpayers from scams and the perpetrators that are involved in them. And if we're not funded, we're on our heels. The tax system remains complicated. It remains a playground for scam artists to exploit honest taxpayers, scare them, call up someone who's elderly, pretend they're the IRS, convince them to take out their credit card and pay a phantom debt. An underfunded agency, an underfunded IRS means that can be exploited more and more. A funded IRS means we can work to disrupt those types of scams. We can increase our education. We can work with local partners. And we can put tools on the web so that you can either help your elderly parent or that elderly parent can have access to figure out, is this really the IRS? These are tools that other tax jurisdictions are putting in place. And we absolutely have to, in order to protect taxpayers from these risks, put these tools in place. And if we don't have the funding, we can't do it. So these are the choices that we
Thank you. So if we don't fund and we can't protect those taxpayers, they're at the short end of the stick. They're put at risk. At the same time, you've said there's a $650 billion, estimated $650 billion per year tax gap, taxes not being paid. Who really suffers when people cheat on their taxes, don't pay what they owe?
It's the people who pay their taxes, because they're shouldering the broader load for funding the government and its critical operations.
So,
and that's why it's so important to have equity. And that's why it's important to prioritize our enforcement efforts for where we think evasion is most problematic. And the point that I've been making today is when I arrived at the IRS after years of underfunding, I asked the team, where are we most exposed? Where are the risks the highest? Where has this underfunding caused the most damage? And one of the key areas was our ability to keep pace with complex tax situations where evasion was a risk. There are complex tax situations where evasion is not a risk, and that is a place that we will not focus on, but it's the place where there's a risk of evasion.
Yeah, and I'm at the end of my time, so I'll ask the question, and actually I would appreciate an answer in writing, is what is it that makes a complex return, and why does that complexity increase the likelihood or the ability of people to avoid paying taxes that are owed? And I'd like to be able to share that.
Well, just a quick example would be if you're operating in multiple countries.
Right.
And they have different tax laws, and you're shielding your profits in the U.S. to get a lower tax, when the reality is that your economic activity is in the U.S. and you actually owe, and you shouldn't be moving and making it look like to the IRS that your activity is elsewhere in a more tax-advantaged jurisdiction. That means that those that are accurately reporting their profits, the companies that are paying a larger share than those that are cheating the system.
Yeah, it's not just companies, it's wealthy individuals who are able to shelter.
Commissioner Werfel.
Yes, sorry about that, yes.
I'm up here. I'm normally down there.
Oh, yeah, okay, I was the chairman, okay, got it.
An IRS consultant named Charles Littlejohn stole a trove of tax return data, including returns from President Donald Trump and a host of other prominent American taxpayers, and released them to multiple media outlets in 2020 and 21. Last month, I was pleased to see that Mr. Littlejohn received the maximum sentence of 5 years in federal prison for his crime. In addition to criticizing the Biden administration's DOJ for only bringing one criminal count against Mr. Littlejohn, Judge Anna Reyes told Mr. Littlejohn at his sentencing that his crusade to violate President Trump's rights was an attack on our constitutional democracy, and I could not agree more. What troubles me even more is that the IRS has taken far too long to implement the corrective actions necessary to ensure that other American taxpayers do not become victims of a rogue IRS employee like Mr. Littlejohn. The Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration recently reported that the IRS failed to ensure that all its sensitive systems provide accurate audit trail logs to monitor and identify unauthorized access. Essentially, TIGTA is saying that you did not know when sensitive taxpayer information was illegally accessed. I understand Mr. Neal asked you about this, and you said that you guys have taken corrective actions since that report came out, was last week, February 6th. What specific actions have you taken, and have you taken all three of the recommendations that TIGTA made in their report?
Yes, we've taken a bunch of actions. I'll be very quick just to kind of give you a flavor of them. We've reduced the number of users. We've put more robust encryption in place. We've strengthened our oversight. We have improved our access logs. We've eliminated more removable media. We've put in place tighter email controls, new printer controls, and on and on and on. And on this point, this is such a critical point on the audit trails in our systems. TIGTA had identified, I think it was somewhere between 300 and 400 systems in the IRS that had sensitive data that didn't have the appropriate audit trails. I required the team, I think it was almost like my third or fourth day at the IRS. I said, I want audit trails in every one of those systems consistent with TIGTA's requirements. Those have now been done. We shared that with TIGTA, but TIGTA didn't have sufficient time to validate that we did everything we said we did.
So when was all that completed?
That was completed by the end of the fiscal year, so around September 30th.
So all of the 3 recommendations that
yes,
TIGTA is how you respond to?
Yeah, they're evaluating. We've said we agree. We're making the changes. We've made the changes. Here they are, and TIGTA's now, thank you. We're going to evaluate and see if you've done it exactly the way we want you to do it. So they're re-examining whether, for example, our audit trails are as robust as we believe they are now.
So they're re-examining. So I'm just trying to understand when, because their report just came out.
Yes.
So like you've been there a year.
Yes.
When did you? And I mean, this goes back to the returns were leaked in 2019. It was published in 2020. Then Mr. Littlejohn leaked a second batch in 2020 to ProPublica, which was
Yes.
published in 21. Obviously, you weren't there, so I'm not asking you to vie for what happened during that period of time. But you've been there a year. So is it your testimony today that since you've been there, this has obviously happened, you've started taking corrective actions on these audit?
Oversight review from TIGTA, we've said it's like we've handed in our assignment. We've put in all the audit trails to the systems that you've identified needed audit trails, and they're reviewing that to ensure that we didn't miss any.
So I want to make it clear to the American people today. So the 3 recommendations that were in the report last week that they made, you are stating under oath today that those have been made by the IRS. All of the recommendations in the report.
We've agreed with all the recommendations. I'm stating for the record that the audit trails recommendation has been done. I want to double, triple confirm that we're completed with the other recommendations, but they're all underway.
Can you let the committee know?
Absolutely.
When can we expect that information?
I can probably get back to you by tomorrow or Monday's a holiday, Tuesday.
If you could give that to the chair to disseminate to the committee, I would
Absolutely.
appreciate it. In the 30 seconds I have left,
Please.
We have, in my district, was decimated by Hurricane Ian. In the tax package we just sent to the Senate, which obviously isn't going to pass by today, the extension deadline, all of the people in my district for 2022 tax year are now going to be forced to, by today, file their extension and then have to do an amended return. It's my understanding that it's taking about 20 weeks to process amended returns. What assurances can you give all of the Americans in 45 states who've been affected by a natural disaster who are now going to have to file an amended return that it's not going to take 20 weeks to get their money back from the IRS?
This is a challenging issue, Mr. Chairman. The reason it's challenging, and it's not about making excuses, this is about just sharing the facts, is that our systems, while we are more modern and effective with original returns, we're still on outdated systems on amended returns, and it's more manual. And that's why if you file an original return electronically and select direct deposit, we can get your refund in under 21 days. But if you file an amended return, that's a paper manual process, it takes a lot longer, and it's unfortunate.
Since I gave Mrs. Moore a little bit of extra time, I'll take a little extra time. So what are you guys doing to remediate that? Like, why does it require a paper return? Is there efforts in place to?
Absolutely, yeah. We're doing a bunch of different things. First of all, leaning out our process to see if we can close the gap on those 20 weeks, and also taking the steps to automate our entire infrastructure. This is one of the reasons why the modernization effort is so important. We're also doing a lot more scanning of all of these paper forms, because in a machine-readable format, we can move more quickly.
Thank you for being here today. My time's expired. I now would like to recognize Mr. Fitzpatrick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, thank you for being here today. Sir, as you're aware, the IRS placed a moratorium on processing of new employee retention credit claims through the year's end to allow the IRS to add more safeguards to prevent future abuse and to protect businesses from predatory tactics. In my district, I have many businesses that are impacted by this and are reliant on the ERC. In fact, we have businesses that say they could not meet their payroll because their ERC had not been processed. Specifically, my office's constituent inquiries where businesses are owed in excess of $1 million, preventing them from meeting their own payroll for their employees. It's my understanding that in October of 2023, the IRS issued a bulk taxpayer assistance order on hundreds of current cases involving ERC claims, but that was months ago. So could you just give us an update on where that stands?
Yeah, we are working hard to make sure that we can separate eligible from ineligible claims in the inventory that we have. As I mentioned earlier, it's challenging because we have a lot of inventory and a lot of ineligibility, and we have to figure out what's eligible and what's ineligible. We're making progress. In fact, since we issued the moratorium in September, we're averaging between 1,000 and 2,000 processing a week. So we're getting the eligible ones out the door. And I think since the moratorium, we're nearing $1 billion of ERCs issued. So I think we're meeting our promise to make sure that the moratorium didn't stop us from processing claims that were received before the moratorium. But it's challenging because it's a very complicated program. Eligibility is tough to weed out from ineligible, but it's a focus point for sure.
I want to jump to the direct file system that the IRS has put in place. This committee has asked many times before what the cost of that program would be. At least as far as I'm aware, it's still unknown at this point. First, why did the IRS and Treasury feel it was necessary to create a direct file system when industry already provides many of these options for free to taxpayers? And secondly, could you explain how you concluded and how the IRS concluded that they were authorized to do this, to create, maintain, and update a direct file tax preparation platform?
Yeah. So we believe, a responsibility and an authority under the law to make the tax filing process easier and more beneficial for taxpayers. As an example, if you allow, I mentioned earlier, we provide a callback option now. If you call in, and that took some technology. It wasn't rocket science technology, but we had to implement technology. We didn't have to go to the code and determine was there specific language in the tax code that says, IRS Commissioner, you have the authority to offer a callback option in the call center. So there's a whole set of different things that we can do for taxpayers to give them more options. It's not a mandate. I think it's a much different bar if I were up here saying, I, as IRS Commissioner, am mandating something. What we're saying is it's another option on the menu. And when we look at all the things we've offered to taxpayers over the years as the world has changed, at one point it was telefile, file your returns on the telephone. Now it's file electronically. There's always been this desire to evolve and understand how to meet taxpayers where they are and give them as many options as possible. And that's what this is. It's just an option.
Do we know what the cost of developing and maintaining this platform is?
We do. We have in our public report that we were required under the Inflation Reduction Act, we included a cost chart that explained the cost and with different assumptions. If 5 million taxpayers were to use it, if 10 million taxpayers. But this year, this is really just a pilot. We're still studying it, and it's available in 13 states. It's going to be a relatively small pilot to assess whether this is something that actually should be added to the menu.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner. Thank you so much for your candor. It's always refreshing giving the enormous responsibility that you have and just how important revenue is for the functioning of our government. That's why, of course, we were very much alarmed when this committee voted to cut $80 billion out of funding to the IRS. What kind of an impact would a cut like that have, especially at this time when we're concerned about the federal deficit? What kind of a cut would that have, especially you've articulated very well trying to keep pace with all the technological changes that you're going to, while at the same time humanizing the IRS through your call centers and the ability for people to have direct contact with a human being.
Yeah, I mean, between, our budget was cut year over year between 2010 and 2022. If you add all that up, it's a 25% cut. Our staffing size shrunk to the same size it was in the 1970s. But over those same 12 years, the tax system grew and got a lot more complicated, and we have a lot more to do. Tens of millions of more filers, thousands of changes to the tax codes, new programs, new activities, and a very different world. You know, a gig economy where we used to not have a gig economy, and more global globalization, movement of money, new currencies, and it's just a dramatically different world. So when you take those two together and you underinvest over a period of 12 years, while at the same time the job to manage the tax system grows, it's not a good formula. It leads to underperformance. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is the people that suffer are taxpayers. They suffer because the tax laws still exist. They still have these responsibilities, and it's a stressful experience. And when a problem emerges, if they can't get clarity from the IRS, if they can't get through to us, if they can't get their tax issue resolved, it weighs on them, it's burdensome for them, and it's stressful for them. And that's what's so heartbreaking about an underfunded tax agency. It means that we're not answering the phone. It means that our walk-in centers are shuttered, and it means that our digital tools are stagnating. And that's what it means when you describe, let's pull back the IRS funding. It means that the IRS won't be able to function and help you. And if you're not pulling back the tax laws and the tax responsibilities, but you're pulling back the ability for the IRS to serve taxpayers, then the ultimate harm is to the taxpayers themselves. And that's my impassioned plea to make sure that we don't harm taxpayers by making it harder for the IRS to help them.
I think you've articulated that very well. What I'm interested in as well is, because of the sophistication as we go forward, what is the IRS up against when you're dealing with major corporations or people with great wealth? What does it look like inside the IRS when you're dealing with a battery of attorneys, accountants, and consultants that are going up against government employees?
Well, I start with the volume, right? When you look at the number of audit personnel we had the day the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, versus the number of the highest wealth filers in the United States. And I'm not talking about just above 400,000. I'm talking about the millionaires, the corporations with $250 million in assets. We break it into cohorts. And at the moment the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, we had one auditor for every 150 of the wealthiest taxpayers in the U.S. And these tax returns are long and complicated, thousands of pages, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pages. So I like people to picture that one IRS auditor or examiner backing in 150 truckloads of paper saying, I'll review all that, that's my job. So it's a real volume challenge. So we had to hire more personnel, to evaluate these returns, but also the complicated financial structures, the introduction of new currencies, the more movement of money into international tax jurisdictions, the proliferation of tax havens. All of it, we have to keep up with it. Exactly. It's an investment that we have to make in our subject matter expertise. It's investment that we have to make in our analytics and our predictive modeling, because here's the other issue. If we don't invest smartly, we just start pulling audits, we're going to end up pulling audits from people that are following the laws more regularly and then adding burden to them when they're doing what they're supposed to do. So precision is actually very important here, and you have to invest to get that precision.
Mr. Chairman, I think we should do a hearing at some point, too, on what artificial intelligence means and what it will mean to our agencies, especially those that are guarding our privacy issues as well. But thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner. Thank you for your integrity and your candor.
Mr. Larson, that's a great idea. So, Mr. Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, thanks for being here. Couple things. One,
I'd like to have a conversation, we don't have to do it now, with your team responsible for the donor advisory fund regulations. I want to understand them better. They may be right, they may not be. I have concerns about what y'all would think are conflicts of interest that I think the market has already considered and already manages, if you will. So it's something I'd like to...
have my commitment on that.
Thank you. So I'm sure you have been briefed about the question I have, which is the question I asked you a year ago. You got a lot to keep up with. You did respond in a letter. I referenced in our conversation a New York Post article that talked about the number of firearms and munitions that you all have at the IRS and the number of armed agents. And it went through specific numbers: 3,832 handguns, 600 shotguns, 439 rifles, 15 fully automatic weapons. So it's very detailed. I don't know where they got their information. And I think an appropriate oversight role for us is to, as a check and balance, and for the purpose of transparency to the taxpayers and to the people that we report to in the people's house, that they ought to have some confirmation of whether or not those numbers are right or if they're different. You responded with a letter and said, the inventory of guns and ammunition is consistent with other law enforcement agencies. I find that an inadequate response. I think if the American people, who we all work for, ask as a check and as a point of accountability on agencies with tremendous power, and with tremendous power comes, I think, great responsibility and oversight and accountability, they deserve a specific answer. What's in the inventory? How many armed IRS agents? I'm not suggesting that there might not be some level of appropriateness, but just saying we keep up with the same standards of who? The FBI, the ATF, the Border Patrol? So I'm going to ask you again, do you have the specifics of firearms, the number of armed IRS agents, and the inventory of munitions? I think the American people ought to know that. And then we can discuss why you have it and why they exist and for what purpose. And again, there may be an appropriate need.
Yeah, I would love to answer this question. First of all, I do recall the letter. I believe the letter that we sent you had a link to a public report that has the information you requested. If it did not, then we will get you that public link. I added the point that it was consistent with other law enforcement after providing the data. If I could, though, I think it's so important, if you could allow me to just address some myths about IRS and guns. First, the vast majority of IRS employees are unarmed and will never be armed. Most IRS employees are customer service reps. I like to say they're armed only with headsets, phone headsets, and most of our accountants all of our accountants armed only with calculators.
And 50% of them are home doing it instead of in their offices, but that's a different issue.
Second, the only people in the IRS that would ever be armed are federal law enforcement officials who investigate crimes in the context of very dangerous scenarios: organized crimes, criminals operating on the dark web, narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, terror financing, money laundering. The idea of sending these law enforcement officials to go execute a search warrant or an arrest warrant without being armed along with their other law enforcement colleagues is not something that would ever be a smart or prudent thing to do. Third, and this is about our inventory, I think it's important context, the actual discharge of any weapon by an IRS law enforcement official is extremely rare. But under federal regulations, we are required to maintain a minimum amount of ammunition for training purposes in order for them to be able to hold a firearm when they're executing a search warrant on a dangerous criminal. And so when you see the ammunition numbers in that public site, don't assume that that is ammunition that is used by the IRS ever. It's really just for training.
I got 5 seconds left.
Yep.
I appreciate all that. I'll look at that link.
Please.
If it's in there, then I may have missed it.
Yep.
If it's not in there,
I will get you the data.
you'll give me the specifics so we can
Absolutely.
share with the American
Yep.
people, so we can, okay. That's good. That's all I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tenney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I see the ranking member is up there too, and thank you both for holding this hearing. And thank you, Commissioner. I know this is a long morning and afternoon for you. And I just want to jump into a couple of quick things. So, Commissioner Werfel, as Israel continues to fight the war that Hamas started with a vicious attack on civilians on October 7th, 2023, which includes the efforts to recover hostages that continue to be held underground in Gaza, disturbing demonstrations have swept through our college campuses and around our nation and here at home. Many of these demonstrations have been explicitly anti-Semitic, and some have called for the death of the Jewish people. This committee held a hearing in November where we heard from witnesses that explained how certain groups behind many of the events calling for violence against the Jewish people are funded through tax-exempt organizations. Multiple witnesses raised concerns that tax-exempt groups in the United States have ties to and may be providing material support to Hamas, a terrorist organization. Do you share my concern about the shocking rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses, particularly, and across our society?
Well, first, thank you for this question. It is a tough question and a tough issue. And I do share concerns. I find calls for hate. I find anti-Semitism. I find Islamophobia abhorrent, reprehensible, heartbreaking. As I put on my commissioner hat and run the process of determining whether an organization is exempt or whether an organization should be revoked of their exempt status, we have a process that we run. And what I want to make sure is that we run that process robustly and effectively to make sure the right outcome happens.
Right, I understand that. And also, along with my other Ways and Means colleagues, we sent you a letter along with Secretary Yellen, as you know, asking for a briefing on what the IRS and the Treasury are doing regarding the funding of anti-Semitism and particularly the funding of calls for violence against Jewish people and using tax-exempt organizations. And I understand that you are in the process of doing that and putting a briefing together
that briefing
for
is
us,
happening, yep.
which we greatly appreciate. But do you share our concern that there could be money flowing, particularly potentially international money that we can't track, flowing to tax-free for these horrific purposes?
I want to make sure that exempt organizations are meeting their responsibility to operate for exempt purposes. And there are certain activities that could mean that their exempt purpose or their exempt activities should be revoked. Those typically orient around illegal activity. And what I want to make sure is that we have a very robust process in place. We get a lot of referrals. I want to make sure that we're running those referrals down and having a good assessment and a good process to figure out what the right outcome is.
Well, can you share with us any information about what the IRS and Treasury are doing about considering penalties, for example, revoking their tax-exempt status for these groups that are engaged in this kind of violent conduct? Obviously, many of these organizations and many of these so-called grassroots efforts look very astroturf. They have assets well beyond what they should have or could have possibly in a spontaneous way. What can we see in terms of taking that status away?
I think this is an important moment in time, Congresswoman, for the IRS, Treasury, and other federal agencies to come to this committee and others and lay out exactly what today's process is, what the current law and regulations say, and to determine whether we have both a sufficient framework and is it being implemented effectively. And that's a conversation that absolutely needs to happen right now.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And I want to just jump on one other topic that my colleague, Mr. Fitzpatrick, touched on. And that is, I have serious concerns about the direct file program. And my constituents fear, and I think rightly so, the IRS being the judge, jury, and executioner of their personal finances. Additionally, this program presents a clear conflict of interest, I believe, for the IRS, who should not be in charge of preparing taxes while performing other duties simultaneously, such as audits. And as you know, my home state of New York is already participating in this program. And another concern of mine is New York taxpayers could struggle to navigate between the two disparate systems and ultimately fail to file in the state or the federal. And I don't know, I want to know, what are you doing? I know you only have a few seconds left, but what are we doing to address this issue and this potential problem, especially as we're seeing issues in New York State?
So we are certainly not preparing taxes. You should let your constituents know. They are under no obligation to use this solution if they don't want to use this solution. We will determine through this pilot the pros and cons of such a solution, and I'll be back before this committee to report on that.
Thank you. We just want to make sure it doesn't become a mandate. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time today, and thank you so much for the response and also action on this really important issue with Israel and Hamas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me, and to you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. And thank you, Commissioner Werfel, for your testimony. I just want to start out by thanking you, and if you wouldn't mind conveying to your staff my gratitude. And when I mention your staff, I don't just mean your senior team that we most often interact with, but with every one of those IRS employees and all the field offices around the country who do a really tough job under difficult circumstances. In one of my past careers, I was the county treasurer, the tax collector for my county, and I know that typically when we are interacting with customers who are paying their taxes, they're not always having their best day. And I know it's a difficult job, and I just want you to convey my gratitude to them for the difficult work that they do, and the fact that in some cases they have to face, I think, unfair characterizations from some of the people that I work with here in this building. And I just want to express to you that I appreciate their work. I'd also like to thank you for the difficult work that you did during the pandemic, your team, because
Absolutely. Yep.
we were not in that position. My constituents in mid-Michigan needed help getting in contact with the IRS just to deal with very simple issues, and I know we had some struggles there, and I think thankfully because of the investments that we have been able to make with the leadership of President Biden and congressional Democrats, the IRS is in a better position, much better prepared to provide the level of customer service that the American people deserve. And I know you're continuing to work to improve that, and I appreciate that very much. I'd also like to acknowledge the steps that you've taken to make this tax filing season easier for the people I represent by delaying the lower 1099K reporting requirement. This delay will cut red tape for many taxpayers and allow the IRS to focus on ensuring that those wealthiest individuals that you have referred to a few times in this hearing and those largest corporations can no longer avoid paying the taxes that they owe. The investments that President Biden and Democrats made under the Inflation Reduction Act are also helping expand access to filing, and you've addressed this. I know it's been raised by a number of members, but as has been mentioned, this includes expanding the volunteer income tax assistance and the tax counseling for the elderly programs, which for years have helped the working families that I represent get their taxes filed without having to pay a fee. I understand the point my colleague makes, but I think the point that you make is that we don't ask people to pay a fee for access to those. They are supported by taxpayer dollars, but not an out-of-pocket fee in the moment that need is made. Those programs are operated locally by United Way back home for me. Yep. So the VITA and TCE programs are really important to me. And I wonder, particularly as helping people access the benefits that they deserve, the EITC and child tax credit. And I wonder if you can describe the IRS plan to expand VITA and TCE and what effect you think this will have for the people I represent.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think there is a concerted effort under our modernization plan, we call it our strategic operating plan, to meet taxpayers where they are, and in particular, to figure out how we can connect with vulnerable populations to provide them assistance, often volunteer assistance, so that they have a better understanding of their tax obligations, but also what credits they may be eligible for that they're not receiving. How do we do that? First of all, I think it's absolutely important that we're on the ground. And so we're using new funding to open more walk-in centers, to extend the hours of those walk-in centers, to have Saturday hours, to have special events and taxpayer experience days.